Welcome to This Is Not an Essay, an audio podcast? No, a visual podcast? A visual podcast. An exploration, if you will, of escapism and fantasy throughout the 20th and 21st century. My name is Cody. I am a professional writer, as you could say, and forever student. This is my brother, Casey, who is the taller, less handsome one of the two, who is a professional artist in the sense that he does art professionally.
Aspiring professional?
Aspiring professional artist. Anyway, today we're going to be looking into something that is like very near and dear to our nerdy little hearts, because we are also professional nerds. And that's kind of the evolution of fantasy and escapism, again, throughout the 20th and 21st century. So we'll be covering a lot of franchises that mean a lot to us. We'll be covering a lot of like the history of how they evolved over time. And I think when it comes to this project, Casey and I sat down to watch a lot of movies and consume a lot of media. And I think something we realized pretty quickly, that as we were going to cover what fantasy is, what escapism is, it's like rapidly drinking out of an increasing pressure fire hose. So I think it's really important to kind of upfront say, hey, this is not an extensive survey of all of there is for escapism. This is not a comprehensive guide or documentary to all that there is. Because as technology increases, as things become more mass-produced and more available to the public, methods of escapism and methods of consuming media just evolves at such a rapid pace that it would be impossible to kind of touch on everything. So what we have done is picked a few franchises, a few cornerstones that we feel are important to the evolution of escapism as a reaction to not just growing technology, but a reaction to trauma, global trauma. Because as we kind of go through all these different things, we'll be pointing out, how certain franchises came about, how certain ways to escape, and what you find in these worlds came about. So I've been saying the word a lot, but like, what is escapism? Okay, so escapism has like a good and bad definition. I think the bad definition, at least when you look at like modern psychology, is they talk about like escapism being a way to avoid your problems. Like, this is how I'm gonna not deal with like today sucking ass. I'm just going to log into a video game and not really solve anything. And I think a lot of escapism gets kind of wrapped up in there. But I also think it is a place where, like on the good side, a place where you can fix problems, where you have powers to fix problems, where you have agency over the world, or at least get to a place where you know that the good guy is going to win in the end. And in that case, I feel like escapism is a essential survival tool socially. As like globalization happens, we get closer, a lot more people are butting heads, and there's a lot more tension. I think escapism is a good way to kind of deal with that. So that's kind of like our definition of escapism right now. It's like a place that is either manufactured by another author or by other creative minds that you can kind of go into and get lost in for a while. So that's kind of our working definition for what escapism is. And our first stops on the escapism train is two authors. One you've definitely heard of, one few people have heard of, but there's people owe him a lot, and that's going to be Robert E. Howard and J.R.R. Tolkien. Before we started, Casey, did you have any idea who Robert E. Howard was?
Didn't know who Robert E. Howard was. I knew the characters that he wrote, and I understood like that kind of trope beforehand of like big buff man saves the world.
Yeah.
But I did not know who the like originator of it was before this.
Yeah. Okay. So Robert E. Howard, Robert E. Howard and Tolkien, by the way, they start writing around the same time. So Robert E. Howard was born in 1906 in Texas, and Tolkien was born in 1892 in South Africa. But they both start their writing careers in the 1910s, like when they start dabbling and going around. Tolkien starts writing because of World War One, and he's obviously did a little bit of work before that as a schoolboy, but we're focused on Howard right now. So Howard grows up in Texas during the oil booms, and from what he saw, right, it was just a violent, disgusting world. I think he was 12. And because his dad was a doctor, they'd go from oil town to oil town, patching things up, making a living. And that the violence that he saw kind of informs his most famous character, Conan the Barbarian. I think a lot of people know Conan. I think a lot of people, when they think of Conan, they associate it with the Arnold Schwarzenegger film in the 80s, which we'll get to in a little bit. But Conan the Barbarian is a product of this anxiety of always being surrounded by violence. I mean, Howard, by all accounts, when he was little, when he was a small guy, he was a nerd, right? His dad was a doctor. He took to reading a lot. So his companions were books, and he got picked on a lot because he was a small statured kid. And just the abuse of being picked on, not just by peers, but kind of go out in town and you're in this rough oil boom place, right, where there's money to be made, there's a lot of criminal activity going on, because this isn't this is the early 1900s, right? So I imagine it's almost vigilante style justice, and after a while those outlaw figures, at least to Howard, I think one of his role models was a gunslinger who just killed some guy for vigilante justice. What's his name? Hold on. John Wesley Hardy was his idolized gunslinger. But Howard saw that violence is a good way for good people to provide safety, which is interesting. That whole thing with that adage of the only thing that'll stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? This is kind of where Howard is coming from, which maybe it's just a culture to deal with Texas. Maybe it's just growing up around that violence. I mean, he's only a generation removed from frontier life. So everybody that he ran into and all of the people that he grew up around also lived when Texas was truly a frontier space. There was still not just violence between fellow colonizers, but indigenous resistance. So he's kind of born into a world that was still violent, and then he gets carried on in this violence, which you see a lot of in Conan the Barbarian. One of the quotes that he had written, that I had written down, is apparently not. Great. Yeah. Civilized men are more discourteous than savages because they know they can be impolite without having their skulls split as a general thing. So this violence really gets into Conan. But now, what is the world of Conan the Barbarian, right? So Conan the Barbarian, he comes out in 1932, right? And it takes place in the Hyborian Age, which is Earth, our lived in Earth, exactly 10,000 years ago, right? And Conan is a I guess I got to start with how the story of Conan happened. So Howard writes for serials, like pulp serials. So it's more of like you submit short stories and it kind of like gets out there. So there is no origin for Conan per se. It's not like a standard novel where like, well, he was born and blah 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 blah, and then you have like an epic like Lord of the Rings, right? So you have these short stories coming out that covers Conan. Like in one serial, he can be like 17 and in the woods, and the other, he's like a 40-year-old king, right? And he's like he's like governing over people. So it's like it's inconsistent. But the point is that these facts of his stories are, Conan is a man who grows up exclusively like in the wilds, right? He like raises himself, pull himself up by his own bootstraps, like learns how to speak to animals. He's like multilingual. He's like your definition of a self-made man, and he solved a lot of his problems with strategy and violence, which again is like that whole trope of like big strong men. Like you were talking about tropes earlier. Howard invents the tropes, right? Like that kind of becomes like also the formula is like scantily dressed woman in need of rescuing, big strong man. A damsel, yeah. Like Howard kind of invents these tropes for the serials. But the Hyborian Age is like bringing it back. The Hyborian Age is like this Earth 10,000 years ago. So a lot of the people and faces that you see are like all today are all come from these ages, and it's like Conan's adventure through like Hyboria, right? Like this is after the sinking of Atlantis, right? Because Atlantis was still a thing. But yeah, so Howard's character of Conan is a reaction to this changing world of violence between oil booms and people getting rich, and watching like Howard really hates wealthy people like a lot. Like he thinks they're the most like lowest scum on the planet, or just like the wealthy like fat cats who never have to do anything, right? And they just get paid.
Yeah, I mean that definitely makes sense. I can imagine growing up in a world where might makes right kind of thing. The only reason that these people are around here being so like tough is to make money, but that money is really being made by the rich people. So even though they're like literally sacrificing their lives to be out here in this rough and tumble town, they're not actually getting anything but a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, and like he sees that inequity is like just the worst sin, and so like his character Conan like takes care of it. He levels the field. Like a lot of the tropes in Conan too, when he fights bad guys, it's always like the evil king at the top, right? Who kind of like pays people to like go after Conan, or like there's always like that element to it, right? And it's just like it's interesting to see that that very I would say like transparent reflection of the world that Howard's growing up in and what's in Conan. Howard eventually does commit suicide in 1936, so he didn't live very long. He was 30 years old when he died, which kind of speaks to another part of his character and like how he was dealing with the world, right? Which wasn't great. I'll put it okay. So like one of Tolkien's best friends in writing was C.S. Lewis, the guy who wrote like Narnia, right? Like, but Howard also had a friend, right? Howard also had a writing friend who was another juggernaut, and that was H.P. Lovecraft. The reclusive nerd who's just racist and fucking everything else that you can imagine. Like that guy, that was Howard's friend. They were like pen pal buddies, right? So I don't know, maybe they fed off each other's like misery and being scared of everything outside. But when Howard's mom, she got tuberculosis, I believe, and passed away, and he was just like, I can't do it, and literally like walked out of her house like when she went into a coma, sat in his car, and just like killed himself. So that sucks. But that's Howard, right? Without Howard's Conan the Barbarian without this foundation of like what's called now sword and sorcery, without Howard's invention of the Hyborian Age. And remember, like this is coming out in 1932, so even though Tolkien and Howard are writing at the same time, Howard's stuff is coming out first. Like they're not influenced. Tolkien isn't influenced by Howard at all, but he sets the foundation for a lot of tropes that we will see in the future, especially when we get into the 70s and stuff like that. With sword and sorcery, like all of that can be traced back to Robert E. Howard's Conan. So that's Conan in a little tiny nutshell. We could obviously write an entire book, and in fact, there are books about Conan, like Flame and Crimson, this one behind, which is an entire book on sword and sorcery. So it's like how in depth you want to go. We could be here all day just talking about Conan. The second one, little people kind of know him already, right? I talked about him, Tolkien, right? Maybe you've heard of him.
Small indie writer.
Yeah, small indie writer, small in the, you know what I mean? You probably haven't heard of him. But if you haven't heard of him, what he did is he wrote this thing called Lord of the Rings. Crazy, right? I think it had a movie or something. It had an animated film in the 70s. It was pretty big. That was The Hobbit. Yeah, great, right? He's the guy who lent his creativity to that. Anyway, so like how does... Unlike Howard, right, which is kind of the problem with Howard, we didn't know a whole bunch about him, right? Like Howard didn't have meticulously kept journals. He had a few friends, so what we know of Howard isn't as direct about what we know from Tolkien. Tolkien, being a man of letters and words, he kept meticulous diaries. He kept letters, notes. So we know a lot more about Tolkien and what informed Lord of the Rings, like what he was dealing with to kind of come out with Lord of the Rings. And I'm including The Hobbit because The Hobbit came out a lot earlier than Lord of the Rings, and it kind of had to get shoehorned into everything, right? So like The Hobbit was like once like just like a bedtime story for his son Christopher. It had nothing to do with it. It was just like a standalone piece. And then it had to get woven into like the mythology later with like the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings, and it all kind of like ends up getting smashed together. But we're not there yet.
It was a pretty good weave, I'll say.
Well, he spent his entire life working on it, like just his whole damn life. He's got like 50 plus years in this world that he's built, and he left us this gift, which is Middle Earth, which is another like escapist place, which is another not just franchise, but I don't know how many people have gotten lost in Middle Earth, right? Like how many people have seen themselves in the Shire or Rivendell or really have put themselves alongside the journey of the ring. And we know a lot more about him than we do, or Tolkien. We know a lot more about Tolkien than we do Howard. So like, but how does Middle Earth get formed? How does Lord of the Rings happen? I mean, I guess it starts with after Tolkien loses his mom and dad. So Tolkien's dad. So he was born in South Africa. I said that a long time ago. His dad was born in South Africa, and he passes away. So he moves back to Birmingham in England with his mom, which they're there until he's about 12. So when he's around 12, his mom dies. And what ends up happening is he ends up like, so, oh gosh. So many backtracking. His mom is a converted to Catholicism. So she was Protestant originally. His father was Catholic. And so Tolkien gets raised between these two worlds. And in England, in early 1900s, like Protestantism is still pretty big, and like the whole Catholic versus Protestant thing is still a point of contention. But when he goes back to Birmingham with his mom, he ends up what do you call it? Living on his aunt's farm, which the name of his aunt's farm. Can you guess the name of his aunt's farm?
Animal Farm.
Shut up. No. His aunt's farm is a Bag End.
Oh
yeah. Wow.
Almost as if Bilbo was.
Oh jeez. So after his mom dies, right? She wants Tolkien and his brother to be raised Catholic, because she like converted last minute, and that was like a big deal in the family. Like so much so that they were just like, get out of here, right? like
Ooh.
Yeah, I know. Like so he ends up going to live with like this his caretaker, Father Xavier Francis. He ends up going to Birmingham school, Catholic school up there. But what he sees is what's important, right? So Tolkien kind of like grew up in this rural farmstead, and like him and his brother played in the woods, like like we did when we were kids. Like that whole running around imagination crap that you lose as you get older. But on the fringes of that is urban creep, right? So in the early 20th century, the kind of like the rise of urban living, urban sprawl is becoming popular. Like there's just more money to be made in factories, and there's money to be made on farms, right? And so the world that Tolkien grows up in as a kid, that like nostalgia era, right, between like 12 and 14, like all of that starts going away. Like layer by layer, like houses come up, factories come up, people are less interested in tilling the land as they are. Just like why bother living on a farm when I can just make more money in a factory and like go to the store and buy my stuff. Like why am I like having why am I growing my own food? So subsistence farming becomes like less and less of a thing. And so like Tolkien watches like the landscape that he grew up in like slowly get reduced to like nothing. By 1851, over half the population of England lived in settlements of 2,500 or more, and by 1890 it's up to 80%. So like the country rural life is already disappearing, and this is something that even though Tolkien was exposed to like just a little bit of, right? Like he didn't grow up when in the 1850s where like everywhere was like farm. Like he like just from what he saw on Bag's End and what he saw like working with his aunt, like already he's watching it shrink and shrink and shrink. He said in his letters, because he kept meticulous letters, he said, the country in which I lived in childhood was being shabbily destroyed before I was 10. And so like this is a big part of Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth. The man-made, the artifice against the natural. I think we see that most with like Isengard, where Saruman is like ripping down the forest to power his orc war machines. And like I think in moments like that, it's very transparent to see the the simulation or the similarities between like real life and
the world he grew up in.
The world he grew up in, yeah. But it's not just like that transparent. It's also like power, right? Like why is the world being destroyed? Why is the world he grew up in being destroyed? The same reason that the world was being torn apart in Texas and oil booms for Howard. It's like the power of like wealthy people to expand their wealth and power, and like that is a big deal throughout Lord of the Rings. So it's not just like the artifice itself, that man-made like steel and war machine, but power, And that whole thing I said about Tolkien being Catholic, right? That's a big deal. I didn't just mention his faith for no reason. So, as Tolkien kind of grew up in his faith, he started seeing like this struggle of good and evil, right? Everywhere. No more so than in the trenches of World War One, where he was a signals officer. So he goes up for Birmingham. He watches like the land that he loves get slowly crept and destroyed, right? And if you're like, that isn't soul crushing enough, and if that doesn't like impact you enough, after he leaves school, he goes to Oxford, graduates, straight into World War One.
Nice.
Right? Like, no break. And not only that, not only does he like, one of his very first like battles is like the Somme.
Even better.
Right.
Right into it.
Right into it. Yeah. And by the end of it, he's lost all but one of his friends. All of like his closest friends from university. All of them but one. Like, in that kind of so like while he's in the trenches, by the way, he's writing poetry to kind of cope with this loss. He's writing this poetry to not only cope with loss, but his wife Edith. He's writing about missing her, and all of this poetry and language kind of becomes the seed, the compressed seed that will sprout into Lord of the Rings. So, like the Dead Marshes, for example. You've seen in the movie where it's just like nothing but like barren
Yes.
Right? Like those are that's all like
no man's land.
Yeah. And there's a good picture of that, which I kind of will put it in perspective, which we'll show on the screen now. Great. Now we have to edit that in.
Yeah.
Right? You're welcome.
Or edit it out.
Oh. But that informs that World War One experience, that loss of friends, that needing to believe that everything that he sees, that there is a reason for it. For him, like his faith tells him, like there is good and evil, and the evil is not necessarily. It's that power. It's that lust for power. Like that becomes, that becomes a lot of the horror elements, Morgoth and Sauron, and why people, why the ring corrupts. That is not only rooted in his faith with like how he pictures like evil, right? But like that's something that he's living through in a first-hand experience of war. And at first, when he first starts in the war, he talks about he sees the Germans as purely evil, kind of like orcs, right? Like he just sees them as like evil beings. But as the war continues, he starts questioning whether or not they are evil. Like there's this famous line that Sam says. Like in the movie, they made Faramir say it, but in the book, it's through Sam, right? Like there's a scene where they get captured by Faramir, and then they get attacked by Easterlings, and like they're looking at like Sam's looking at this dead guy, and he says, it was Sam's first view of battle of men against men, and he did not like it very much. He was glad that he could not see the dead face. He wondered what the man's name was and where he came from, and if he was really evil at heart, or what lies or threats had led him along on the long march from his home, and if he would not really rather have stayed there in peace. So like he kind of starts evolving his mindset like as World War One continues, right? And he's like, are they really our enemies, or have they just been manipulated into fighting? And it's like that power that manipulates, that power that corrupts, that becomes the seed of evil that he sees. And I think that's why you know, the ring is an important figure, right? Because the ring doesn't kill anybody outright. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't pick up a sword and just start hacking heads off. But it's like the promise of power, the lies that, like, not just power, but like when Sam puts on the ring, right? He sees a garden, like, or not when he puts on the ring, but when he has the ring and he's holding on to it, like at the very end, like what is like Sam seeing? He has a vision of like this beautiful garden, and it's like, if you just put on the ring, like, we can make the world a garden. We can do it, right? And I think in terms of escapism, when we look at the world of Middle Earth and what's informed it, we have this world that is being eaten away by artifice, and we have this like this great evil, right? That corrupts. Like, that's how it moves through. And I feel like for anyone, and like why Lord of the Rings is so evocative and thought provoking and such an escapist place, is because that kind of evil feels very tangible. Even, you know, Lord of the Rings came out in 1954, so even after all these years, like, that's still something that rings true. But what Tolkien did is, in Middle Earth, he showed us that, like, that evil can be defeated, not by like one great person, but like by a group, by a team, by fellowship. And I think that's why a lot of people still like to escape to places like Middle Earth. That's why we still like to engage with the story, whether it's like through video games or reading the books. Is because, like, it shows us that no matter how small we are or how hopeless things seem, like, you can still win. Like, in the end, good will still triumph because it's supposed to. There's this like famous scene in the Silmarillion where Melkor, who's like Sauron's like boss, like, he's the first and mightiest, right? Like, he's the real Lucifer figure. Like, he like tries, they're singing creation, and like everyone's like, ah, like, it's really nice, and then Melkor's over there like, and all the other angels are like, wow, thanks, can you stop? And so like he starts it again, and everyone's like, ah, like enjoying themselves, and Melkor's going like just hammering home evil, right?
A rebellious spirit.
Yeah, and he's thinking like he's doing all this stuff and really putting it to it. And Iro Lubitar, who is God, is just like, you know, everything you're doing is because I designed it. There's nothing you can do that isn't like a part of me or I haven't thought of, essentially. It's like, so it's like, even at the end, like, the whole reason for like evil existing is to make humanity better, right? Like, because there's only certain lessons that you can learn through adversity, and I think it's really easy to like see that in our own lives.
Like touching a hot stove.
Yeah, I don't know what's adverse about. You just don't do it. Like,
well, you gotta learn not to do it.
oh yeah, you know, sometimes you just gotta.
Some lessons you gotta learn by doing them.
Yeah. But when we talk about escapism, all right, so kind of wrapping it up here on Tolkien, in this first powerhouse, right? Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings purposely as escapism, like with the intention of being escapist, is why he wrote Lord of the Rings. He said, basically, people kind of were bouncing back about like escapism, and like whether it was like frivolous or like a childish thing to escape. You know what I mean? Like, why escapism? Like, what are you doing? Like, what? Like, and he said, why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics other than jailers and prison walls? The world outside would not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word. And what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, PTSD wasn't exactly a thing back then, and having gone through World War and so much death, I can only imagine the need to.
And then losing his parents.
Yeah, losing his parent. I can only imagine the need to like rationalize all of it, or at least process it in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's definitely a very clear one-to-one between the evolution of his life and the story of Lord of the Rings. Like, growing up on the farm, growing up in the Shire, this intangible kind of like evil leader directing armies towards each other, world wars. So I can definitely see a need to escape. I don't think in this case it would be considered. I don't see how they could consider it like desertism or desertion.
Because I think that's the main critic of escapism, right? Is the fact that people like to escape something is you're deserting your problems. You're saying, I'm going to go do anything else other than work on what needs to be worked on. Right? And
how else are you supposed to process all that? I mean, it's not like they had any sort of like...
You know what? Bootstraps.
Bootstraps.
Figure it out.
Oh, you got PTSD?
Yeah.
Just don't.
Yeah, just stop having it. And I think that's what he means, like the escape of the prisoner, because the real world, real problems are always going to be there. But if you don't allow yourself a space to feel hopeful, if you don't allow yourself a space to feel like things can be conquered, right? If you don't give yourself that kind of time, what else is there? Like imagine a world where it's like, nah, I just gotta straight up deal with problems, right? Like what do you do I don't do anything. I just I go to work, deal with my problems there, and I go home and I sleep. Don't dream. I have nothing to dream about.
That sounds like a horrible. Sounds like a horrible like dead end job, 9 to 5.
Yeah.
Permanent retail.
Permanent.
Just deal with problems all day.
Yes, and I think like in that terms, like these early 20th century pieces of Tolkien and Howard, like I think they are reacting to a very sporadic and quick changing world through industrialization, through like guys jockeying for power, through like Tolkien living through like the World War, for Howard living through like I feel like this way, like it was a way for them both to cope. And I think the problems they were coping with aren't so foreign to everybody else. That, like these are things that allow us to continue to see ourselves in these problems, in these situations.
Yeah, these are definitely reoccurring problems.
Yeah, I mean, who else? Like, I try to imagine again going back to retail. Who hasn't sat there and go like, if I could just split this guy's skull, he can just civilize me. You know what I mean? Like,
no receipt return.
Right? No, trust me, bro. I bought it here.
Yeah, no, you didn't. We don't even sell that.
No, you don't understand. So I think when we come to like this ending up on like what these early pieces is like these two guys were coming in at such a time that like Tolkien's high fantasy a lot and Howard's sword and sorcery become like these worlds that a lot of people who feel disenfranchised, who feel like, beaten up by the world, come to escape. I mean, the access to it, especially when we talk about like who has access, which is another important piece, right? Like, first of all, to engage with Howard, because Howard came first in the 30s, you had to have expendable income to buy the pulps to read them, right? And you had to be literate. Again, we're talking 1930s America. So there are still entries to engaging with escapism here, right? And as things press on, that bar of entry is getting lower and lower. But you had to be literate. You had to have expendable income. And you had to have time to read, right? And I think like we just keep that in mind as we go forward, right? So there's still a bar. I mean, Tolkien came out in 1954, so things are a little bit better, but he's still pretty verbose. And there's still a lot going on. So, again, you had to be really committed to engaging it like Tolkien. Whereas like Conan, you didn't have to be as committed because these are like 15-page stories where it's just like fast paced and fun, kind of adventure-y. Tolkien is a little bit more of an investment of your time. But there are still entry fees to escapism. But I mean that's kind of where we're ending off is like these men grew up in changing worlds of values, of industry, and just general world dynamics are shifting, right? Like don't forget, not only was he growing up in the oil boom, but like Howard was growing up between the 20s and 30s, between the great,
the Roaring 20s and the Great Depression.
Yeah.
The rapid rise and fall. Yeah, no, I could definitely see a need to sort of personify what's going on through good guys and bad guys.
And then Tolkien's growing up with, I mean, World War II had already happened by the time Lord of the Rings came out, but like The Hobbit was out, right? And Tolkien was I think I don't think the Silmarillion was out yet at all, but like Tolkien's works were starting to circulate in the 30s and 40s. So I mean, and that's kind of the thing. It's like he's still writing. Like they're writing at these changing world times. Like technology is shifting and changing. Like I think that these kind of works could only come out of that kind of world. I don't think you would like. I don't think Tolkien's work would be as effective if he didn't experience the things that he experienced. I think that's why it kind of hit such a chord. But I mean that kind of wraps up this, like the two most important authors and the two most important worlds coming out of the early 20th century, which is Howard and Tolkien. You have the foundation of sword and sorcery. You have the foundation for like high fantasy, dwarves and elves and all that. We're also kind of staying away by the way, a little late, but we're kind of staying away from like some other pieces of media that just would have been way too intense to get into, like comic book culture. There's way too many comic books to keep track of throughout the early 20th century. Staying away from the horror genre, because that is its own other thing. We will touch on science fiction and stuff like that, but the world of escapism is, especially as technology rises and the bar of entry lowers to like be able to engage with these things, like it's going to explode. But that gets us ready for our next bit, which is the atomic age. August 6th, 1945. America drops the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending our fight with Japan, also changing the entire world. Not only politically, but that advancement in technology reshapes what's possible for the future, right? So like one time frenemies, Russia, Soviet Union, we are no longer speaking, or we are speaking, but we're doing it through like proxy wars. Anyway, and Japan, like we occupy, and so we start having a different relationship with Japan, right? Which becomes important for the technology boom that's about to happen. But bringing it back to nuclear weapons and nuclear power, right? We've entered the atomic age, right? So, like, all of those things in the 20s and 30s that we like wrote about, like sci-fi wise, like spaceships and space shuttle, like all of those things have now literally in a few decades become reality, right? So we now have like the promise of nuclear power. So sci-fi stuff like Flash Gordon and like sci-fi horror like The Thing with aliens, like all of that seems a little bit more tangible now. Now that we have ways to get there, the space race is starting. The 50s are like this explosion of technology, right? Not just like for industry, like as far as like nuclear power, but like consumable things start becoming more prominent. Manufacturing, yeah.
The microwave, the radio.
The microwave, I don't think comes along until like the 70s.
No, the microwave came out right after, not too long after World War II.
Like the 70s. You need to check when the microwave was made. We'll put that fact right there. One of us is either right or wrong. Anyway, so while there's this like promise, this feeling of like amazement and like excitement about nuclear power, like being kind of like the salvation, the elevation of mankind, it's not universally felt that way, particularly in Japan, who did not have the best experience with nuclear weapons.
Understandably so.
Yes. And so in 1954, a film was made. A little film. You may know the title character. They've been in 1998, had a big film. Anyway, but it's called Gojira. I think it translates to Godzilla. Right? So the film Gojira gets made. And I think that is one of the most important parts, because it's when escapism turns not just into like a place where you can see the world better, but it provides a window into, you know, what can go wrong. And I think that becomes an important part, right? So Gojira is released 9 years after the atomic bombs are dropped. So like less than a decade after bombs are dropped, this movie gets made, and it's a very anti-war movie. It is a very anti-weapons of mass destruction movie. And I think it kind of serves as a shadow of like, you know, while we're all like hyped up about the atomic age and robots and spaceships, like there's also a incredible amount of destruction that happens. And I think it's a good time that like, it's a good warning, right? So I think it's also interesting. So like, this is a film that you and I watched, right? So I think once before we had watched the 1954, the Japanese release anyway, because I think in 56, the America releases Godzilla King of the Monsters, which is like their spin-off, and it was like absolutely terrible. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a minute. But this was a film that we both watched for this project. And I never realized, the first time I watched it, it was like, oh, you know, this is kind of a subpar monster movie.
Yeah, it feels like a B-rated movie.
Yeah, I was like, okay, I don't understand. But like, when you add in the historical context of the people that put this film together, Gojira becomes a really dark film. And I think that shifted my perspective on it. I think the opening scene with the fishermen, you know, they're on the boat, and Gojira kind of pops up, and it kind of does the Cloverfield thing. We don't really see him, but you see like the
effects that he leaves behind.
Yeah, and that opening scene, and we talked about it, was very reminiscent of the Lucky Five, the Dragon Lucky Five.
Yeah, the fishing ship that ended up pulling up a bunch of radioactive fish.
Yeah,
and one of the crewmates unfortunately died from it.
Yeah, but that kind of gets like swept under the rug here in the West. But like, I think from start to finish, that entire film is like this, you know, commentary on the destruction of nuclear power. So the people that put the film together, right? From lost me notes. gonna have to cut this entire part out.
That's fine.
Okay.
What's up?
We can cut that out, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Alright. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So the director Ishiro Honda was the kind of guy who helped put the film together, right? So he was selected to be the director because he had anti-war sentiments. He was in World War II, captured by the Chinese, who apparently treated him very well. And he kind of had that moment that Tolkien had where the kind of disillusionment of the whole propaganda you're fed about everyone being evil that's not you. When he becomes more or less friends with the Chinese captors, and he starts thinking about just how terrible this war is, like World War II is, and he that decides what if we never went to war again? You know what I mean? War is just this terrible endeavor that pretty much pockmarks all of this age that we're talking about from 1900 to now. I think no matter what's happening in the pop culture or in society, there's always some kind of war or conflict happening that we are directly involved in. And when I say we, I mean the West, right? But he was very much against war. He was against nuclear weapons, and I think that sentiment comes out strong. A lot of the images in Gojira are very almost one-for-one shots of Hiroshima, and that big scene where you finally get Gojira and he's attacking the city and laying waste to it. They do this epic pan out, and it almost looks identical to some of the scenes from the atomic bombings. And I think here in the West, when the movie finally came to us, it came to us as a monster movie. It started the whole MonsterVerse thing with Gojira, but the fact that it is born out of this people who lived through World War II, lived through Hiroshima and Nagasaki, coming together on this film. Making Gojira an allegory for nuclear weapons. That started the whole MonsterVerse allegory of almost all the monsters in there became stand-ins for nature. Hedorah, the smog monster, I think in the 70s became this allegory for climate change and pollution. Rodan is just nature itself.
It's pretty funny how they lost their well, not funny, haha, but how they lost their personification or stand-in of what they're for when they came over to the West.
Yeah.
Seeing Godzilla being a representation of nuclear weaponry in the movie definitely paints it in a much more darker tone, where over here in the Western release it was seen more as a turn your brain off, watch a big monster smash things kind of thing.
Yeah.
That context was completely dropped when it came over, and probably for a good reason, seeing as how it was less than 10 years ago that we did some pretty terrible things.
Yeah. I mean, throughout that movie, I think it's important to look at. So when it was released in 1956, they cut out a lot of the mentions of nuclear weapons completely. I think at the very end of the 1954 Gojira, one of the professors, the main character there, is talking about how we need to stop nuclear weapons, or it could awaken another Gojira, another force of mass destruction. And for the U.S. release, they just cut that out completely.
Oh,
yeah, that doesn't exist in the U.S. release. Also in the U.S. release, when they're having this big conference to talk about what to do about Gojira, what to do, or like should we tell the rest of the world this is happening? Should we like they cut all that out as well. So any mention of like atomic weaponry, the West was just gone. And so when it got to America, yeah, you're right. It becomes this like whole film for like, wow, big monsters go smash. That's crazy. Also, they introduced in the American version this guy named Steve Martin, not the hilarious guy that gets popular later, but this Steve Martin plays Raymond Burr, who is this like American correspondent who's in Japan, like walking around, and so they like they cut out a lot of scenes where like the Japanese have agency, or like that the Japanese are like talking, like so like there's the oxygen destroyer, which is like the next nuclear weapon that they're going to use to get rid of Godzilla, and whether or not it's ethical to use or not use this, and they just like. There's this big scene in the original movie where they're like talking back and forth, like it's better the betterment of mankind, and then like no, like it's just better to like die with this weapon. I'll never let anybody have it. And in the American version, like they push like Aaron Burr's the Aaron Burr guy, the white guy, to be like, no, we definitely need to use it, and they kind of edit it so it makes it all seem like it's his idea to kill Godzilla. So it's like I think that's just like the 50s, right? Like people of color aren't allowed to have opinions or agency. It's like always has to come through the white guy.
They don't know how to govern themselves. We got to step in and save them.
We got to save them from ourselves. So Gojira happens. And that becomes like a critical, like that becomes a big success here, like that starts the whole kaiju trend, which goes off in science fiction about like big monsters, big like, giant ants coming out from like the whole big monster genre.
They came from outer space.
Yeah, that all starts here, which is interesting. That like or should I say interesting, because the director, right, he had no idea that the film was changed for the American release.
Oh, that's kind of messed up.
Yeah, so Ishiro Honda had no idea that they had changed his movie. Like, they were like, oh yeah, we're going to add in, this Steve Martin, so he plays this white guy, like, we're going to add that in. But they didn't even tell him at all that they were going to, like, change it, so, like, a lot of the key points about like anti-war, anti-nuclear weapons, like all of that.
The main points of like the entire purpose of the movie being made.
Yeah, they had no idea. He had no idea that they were doing that. So, I mean, like there's also this scene on the subway. It was just like these just two characters just talking about like coming away from the council, and they're saying like, oh, I just barely made it out of Hiroshima, so like they had like people who had been in those events, and the American release just cut them out entirely.
What do you mean erasure? We don't do that in the 50s.
The 50s? What? No, McCarthyism is what's that? Who knows? The Red Menace, they're everywhere. So, yeah, it's just like I felt like Gojira was important to talk about, because not only is it like the start of these epic like monster movies, but it's kind of like bringing in, especially later on, like the dark side of like climate change or destruction of the environment. So it touches on a lot of things that like Tolkien had talked about, which become important. But it really is like one of the, anti-nuclear messages in the 50s at this time, where everyone's like, yeah, it's great. But I think Gojira is just a great film to point out, like, hey, it's not all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah, there's definitely dangers that come with great power.
Right? Yeah, and So I thought it was important to mention that. Also, like, you move on to the 1960s, we're going to get into the next big thing, which again, there's so much to touch on. When we get to the 60s, what's going on in America? Civil rights movement's happening. In 1963, we have the March on Washington for Freedom, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 1965. We're going to the moon. There's a lot happening, socially and politically, and I think during this time, a small television show gets released in 1966. Little tiny thing. This guy Roddenberry, you heard of him? Gene Roddenberry.
No.
He makes this television show called Stargate. Yeah, Stargate. No, he makes Star Trek. And Star Trek is absolutely 100,000,000% a product born of the 60s, right? It was like, I think it originally got pitched, Roddenberry originally pitched it as like this Western in space, which is how he got his foot in the door, at least. But he had this like vision of a multi-racial crew, like in space exploring. Like, this is set in a future where we have already solved like the problems of the day, right? And again, why escapism is important is this let us at least picture a world where, like, how did we solve racism, and we don't know yet, but we're just there. So it allowed room to think, and not just racism but sexism. Star Trek was one of the first shows to feature this dynamic cast where, like, men and women of color were, officers, bridge officers. Like, before, like, that kind of idea was almost inconceivable, right? Because, like, on television at the time, the landscape of television is like the, I Love Lucy, Bonanza. Like, there's a lot of westerns, a lot of there's a lot of detective noir stuff going on. The landscape of television is not in space. Like, space is like not something where things that are serious happen. Those are like this is like Flash Gordon, right? This is a space for like kids, right? And what Star Trek did was bring everybody there, right? So Star Trek, just to like cover the bases of like why Star Trek was important, is it definitely challenged a lot of deep-seated sexist and racist views at the time. And again, I think we could talk about Star Trek for hours as far as like diving into it, but for the for brevity's sake, we're only going to touch on a few things about Star Trek. And I think one of the first things that kind of pops into this, for anyone that knows, is this is one of the first television show to have a black woman, Nichelle Nicole, as a bridge officer, right? So this is the first time that like a woman of color is like in a pretty high status bridge officer, and I think that blew a lot of people's minds. And like Nichelle Nicole, also is a part of like what is considered mostly to be the first interracial kiss on television. At the height of like the civil rights, movement, you have this happen, which is so. kind of wheeling back a little bit. So Nichelle Nicole, she's plays officer or Lieutenant Uhura. She's a communications officer. So she does like the first like 2 years, right, of the show. And she's originally like a dancer, or not a dancer, but like an actress. And she gets this chance to be on Broadway. So she tells Gene Roddenberry, like, hey, I'm going to go be on Broadway now. So she more or less gives her 2 weeks notice. So she does that, and she goes out, a couple days later to an NAACP meeting where she's like, being a part of her community, being a part of making a change. And one of the guys goes, hey, there's a fan here to see you. And I freaking love this quote. She says, I thought it was a Trekkie, and so I said, sure, I'll see them. I look across the room, and whoever the fan was had to wait because there was Dr. Martin Luther King walking towards me with a big grin on his face. He reached out to me and said, yes, Miss Nichols, I am your greatest fan. He said that Star Trek was the only show that he and his wife, Coretta, would allow their 3 little children to stay up and watch. She told King about her plans to leave the series because she wanted to take a role that was tied to Broadway. I never got to tell him why, but he said, you cannot. For the first time on television, we will be seen as we should be seen every day, as intelligent, quality, beautiful people who can sing, dance, and can go to space, who are professors, lawyers. Dr. King Jr. went further, saying, if you leave, that door can be closed. That door can be closed because your role is not a black role, and it's not a female role. He can fill it with anybody, even an alien. So, like, the gravity that, like, Dr. King, like, saw the importance of what she was doing, right? Of what Nichols was doing and what, like, that role meant at that time. Because this was, like, everywhere, right? This was, like, anyone could see it. And I think when we talk about accessibility, like with Tolkien and Howard, right? Like you had to buy into it, right? But you had to be literate. You had to have money to buy, continue to buy cereals, continue to be invested in the story. But here you get a television, and you anyone can see that. Anyone can enjoy that content. And to see a black woman in such a powerful role meant a lot for a lot of people. And then, like, on top of that, her and Will Shatner would have the first interracial kiss on television, which, like, that episode I think couldn't even be, like, broadcast in certain states, like Mississippi, because it, like,
shocker.
It like broke some laws. They're like, oh, I don't know if we can see this. It's like, go against the sensibility laws. But, like, this show was integral for everybody because it allowed us to see a future where we had kind of solved a lot of the biting issues of the day.
Definitely seeing like an expansion of the escape, right? Where at first it's like with Howard, it's a very local kind of your own ideology, like putting yourself in the shoes of Conan, as in you're solving the problems within your own realm.
Yeah.
And then goes to Tolkien, where it's you could put yourself in the shoes of any one of those in Fellowship, where you're collaborating together to solve a collective problem.
Yeah.
And then where it goes, with Godzilla, where, it's like a multinational collaboration to solve this one big problem. And then on to Star Trek, where it's a global collaboration to just explore and solve whatever problems they come across.
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me of the Squire of Gothos episode, which we'll talk about in just a second. But I also wanted to point out, too, like, it wasn't just, like, Nichelle Nichols playing Lieutenant Uhura. George Taki, who was a Japanese American, who literally spent, like, his childhood in a Japanese internment camp, was also a bridge officer. So like here, like not even 20 years after Japanese internment, you have a Japanese American, an African American, who are represented as like strong, intelligent people, not just caricatures of of a race, but like just normal people. And the fact that was mind-blowing television like hurts me. The fact that it's like they're people, and you're like,
They're people.
what the yeah,
They're people too.
right? I know, and I'm like, and it's Star Trek that helps make that leap. It's Star Trek that helps like put that in the public consciousness. I mean, even today, like Star Trek continues to like push boundaries with like aliens, androids, like in Star Trek Voyager 7 of 9 with like the Borg, like what it means to be not just human, but like what does humanity mean? Like what does fellowship and strength mean? Like the Star Trek universe is like the entire universe, you know what I mean? Like that, there's so much to explore, so many moral questions to ask, and like I feel like Star Trek gives us a space to like ask those questions and do it in a place where we can already jump over hurdles of inequity. We don't have to. You don't have to sit there and solve those problems on the writer doesn't have to go, well, how do I solve racism? How do I solve institutionalized sexism? How do I get rid of that? Like, you can already move it to a future where that's that problem's been solved and allows us to look at other things. And I think that's wildly important as we like move forward, and to come out at such a prime time. There's a reason why Star Trek continues today. We're getting back to that Squire of Gothos episode. We talk about like so this takes place so Squire of Gothos, about an alien who basically captures the crew, who's been observing humanity for like a million years, right? And he kind of hit like, so he still believes though, because I guess he was watching until he got bored and like misses the whole leap into space. So the Squire Gothos, his name is Traleen. He's got basically god powers, and he still sees humans as like a war-based species. He captures Kirk, and one of the things that he says is, did you know you're one of the few predator species who preys on itself? And I think that line is such like a punch, right? Because to come out too in the 60s, while you would say that, in the middle of all this racial tension and all in the middle of all these hostilities, to be in a spot where in the show, like, say like how like primitive and barbaric it is, like, wow, like you're so at the top that you just kill yourselves. That's crazy. Anyway, like, so Traleen embodies this character of like I love war. He loves, like, that's all he does is like he captures Kirk, the captain, and they like run. He's like brings him to this like mansion where there's like it looks like a 18th century Victorian manor, and all he wants to talk about is guns and fighting, and eventually he traps more than Kirk, and he wants to have like a duel, because he's like, oh, you want to leave? Then we'll have a duel, or like and he's like, okay, and it turns in like this big hunting game. I don't know. The episode itself is such a good like allegory for like, or such a good mirror to how we treat each other, because when you watch it and you're just like, wow, like how he's talking and treating Kirk, and like how he's so hyped up on like violence. Like, how many people have we known that are like that? Especially coming from military backgrounds. Like, guys that are always like, check out my guns, check out this. Like, oh, if I ever had my chance.
I just got a new toy.
Yeah, right? And I think that that's why the Squire Gothos episode hits so hard. Is like I know a lot of people, or have known a lot of people like that, and like at the time to come out in the '60s, that's such like a forward-thinking episode, not just in terms of racial equity, but like thinking about, like how we deal with each other. I don't know.
I do find it like an interesting kind of mirror there when he talks about like how humans are like this violent, like the first thing that they do is resort to violence, and the crew's trying to be like, no, we don't. But when they first met him, they had their guns drawn.
Yeah, it's just security. So yeah, the 50s and 60s are this interesting time between promise and horror, and like as technology advances, accessibility, and as the world gets bigger, who gets to be on the stage, who gets to be like seen. You know, there's a especially with like cameras and photography and things becoming more accessible, who's getting seen, whether it's like on the silver screen, whether it's on like the television, like the stories that are getting passed around, or everything's starting to change. And Star Trek is one of the best examples of forward change. I think it's one of the best examples of like, you know, for the good, or like a hopeful future. Whereas Godzilla is like here's where things could go wrong. Here's like a destructive allegory. And so I think it's an interesting duality between the 50s and 60s as far as like escapism. Star Trek definitely being the one that like sticks out to me the most between the two, but
yeah, it definitely seems like that. Godzilla seems more like a warning to the mistakes of the past, where Star Trek seems more like a hope for the like solutions of the future kind of thing.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot. Again, there's so much going on in the 50s and 60s like we could talk about. And again, I just think that the two things that stuck out the most here are the invention of Gojira and the invention of Star Trek, as far as like long-lasting impacts on escapism and fantasy, and like how they're both born out of these very turbulent, traumatic times. Just like Tolkien and Howard are born out of these traumatic world changes, Gojira is born out of fear of nuclear power and just power, and Star Trek is born out of you know, the civil rights movement and like progress and the wanting of progress, and just trying to show that like the change can happen. I mean, wow. Star Trek again. They invent the idea for the cell phone. So it's not just like racial equality that they're looking forward at. It's like literally without Star Trek we wouldn't have the cell phone, or FaceTime,
or NASA,
or the Space Force emblem.
Or the NASA emblem.
So I just think out of the 50s and 60s, those were the two things that needed to be like looked at the most. Which brings us to our next installment, which is the 70s and 80s. The 1970s. A terrible time to be alive. 100% the worst time. Okay, so what do we have going on, right? America's losing Vietnam, mass protests for women's rights, civil rights. Civil rights movement is kind of, dying down after it peaks in the 70s. But every time you turn on the television, there's something going wrong in America. Munich Massacre, 1972. Right?
Serial killers all over the place.
But even before serial killers, 1973, we have the first oil crisis, where oil prices go up by 300%. Nice. It's great. '74, we have Nixon resigning, the whole Watergate thing going on. That's awesome. Serial killers. We got Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Son of Sam, Ed Kemper, Manson family murders, Jim Jones, the Hillside Strangler. These are all in a decade, by the way. Like, these are all within the same decade. So, that's happening. Elvis died.
Terrible.
But punk and disco are rising, right?
Terrible.
There is, however, televisions are getting cheaper, though. Technology is starting to become more available to the middle class, which will go up and then go down. Disco club culture is becoming a thing, right? But the point is, the 70s are not the easiest time to exist, right? Oh, look. Dog. It's cute. She's off camera. The 70s are not the easiest time to exist. And I think escapism becomes more important during the 70s because there's just a lot going on, right? Like, how do you deal with so much happening constantly? You know, I feel like it's kind of the same way today, where it's like no matter what you do, something bad is happening. And I feel like in the 70s, that was just a lot of what was going on. But it gives us two big cornerstones of fantasy and escapism, which will kind of build off of its predecessors. We get Dungeons and Dragons, and we get Star Wars. Both become very important and very applicable to the evolution of fantasy and escapism, especially today. But kind of, we'll go in chronological order. Start off with Dungeons and Dragons. So, like, Dungeons and Dragons was kind of has its roots in wargaming, which hilariously, like, miniature wargaming. So the idea of like taking a little figure and another little figure and like, bow, 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 oh, you're dead, I win. Like, that whole genre can trace its roots back to H.G. Wells, of all people, who wrote this book called Little Wars in 1913, which is basically like rules for like wargaming. So it was supposed to be like boys would go out back and they'd have these rules on this is what a knight does, and they could like be generals in their own backyards, right? So this started this whole genre of miniature wargaming, which still exists today, by the way. But the idea of like Risk or like chess kind of playing isn't anything new. It's how Dungeons and Dragons evolves in the genre. So Gary Gygax, the founder of D&D, right, the gaming godfather, he and his friend Jeff Perrin come up with Chainmail, which is like a book for more medieval style fantasy play, right? And they all gather together in their Gary's garage and they play. Now, but here's the thing. His friends were also like super big nerds, okay? Like, they are just like, they loved Tolkien, and they loved, wait for it, or I should say Gary loved Conan the Barbarian.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. A direct like relation. And so like they like start wanting to like add these like fantasy elements, right? Like, you know, how many times are you gonna battle the same friggin', knight and cavalry a million times? So they start introducing things like dragons. You're gonna fight a dragon, you're gonna fight a troll, okay? And these like little addendums become so popular that it spawns its own game in 1974, which is known as Dungeons and Dragons. So the original Dungeons and Dragons, by the way, it was a 3-book set. Like 3 little booklets for how to play, right? And I think it's funny that in order to like play D&D, the first edition, like the first like rendition of it, you had to buy their first game, Chainmail. And we're talking like in 1974 dollars, like $10. So I mean, the entry to play, just to buy D&D, like counting for inflation, it's like $60 for 3 little booklets, and you already have to have chainmail for like another $10. So they're looking at $120, and that's like not counting the terrain squares and the pieces and the miniatures. So like the entry to it was big, but they started like playing, with fantasy, and eventually like that kind of morphed into no longer like being a general in control of all kinds of different like people. It became like you could play as one character, and you would be on a team trying to like what we know now today is dungeon crawling. And it added this element to it that transformed it from simple like, war of attrition kind of thing, and that was the element of role playing. So no longer was it like, hey, take this field, hey, defeat all of your enemies. It was like, you are this character. You got to choose from like 1 of 3 races. You got human, fighting man, like his name was Fighting Man, elf, and hobbit, which they got in trouble with the Tolkien estate and like ended up with halfling. So that's kind of hilarious, but it's so much was originally like taken from Tolkien.
Just a direct parallel.
Yeah. Elves, hobbits, dwarves, all of that stuff in gaming, right? They just pulled word for word from Tolkien, and I was like, I like this a lot, but he ends up changing it to like, you got elves, which can be ambiguous. I kept that. Dwarves, ambiguous. Halflings. But you start building this like lexicon of like modern gaming things that we know today. Dungeon crawling. Everyone knows what halfling is. People know what elves are and how they're represented in games. This all comes back to Gary Gygax and Dungeons and Dragons. So this kind of evolution in escapism, right? Because no longer are you just like simply, watching on a screen or reading in a book. Like you are your character. You are, Jeff Fighting Man, right? You are that person, and that immersion is such a leap in like what. Like things that we take for granted today. But for as far as D&D goes, right? Like, it required, like I said, a pretty substantial buy-in to start playing. I mean, even today, like how many books do I have of D&D? Like 8, like $50 a piece. Like it's ridiculous, right? And to like have that kind of disposable income to like be able to play is a big deal. But like D&D just catches on because for people that had access to chainmail, had access to knowing a D&D, because it wasn't like you could just go in the store and like I'm gonna go to like Walmart, Wally World, and like, oh, see, what are these like D&D books? Like you had to have a knowledge of the miniature world, so you already had to be involved in like the gaming, right? You had to have a hobby shop that had miniatures and had a shop that elected to buy D&D. So like as it's getting birds and getting bigger, it's still pretty small. It's really small. You had to know a guy. You had to like know of it yourself. And so like it wasn't as accessible in its first like evolution. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which comes out in 1977, AD&D, which is like the famous red cover with the red dragon on it. Then things start becoming more accessible. You no longer need chainmail, right? You don't have to buy that. And Gary Gygax forms TSR, which becomes like this infamous powerhouse, this flagship that gets run into the ground. But through the 80s, it has this really cool golden age of like campaigns and not just gaming, but it expands into like stories and art, like Dragonlance, which is amazing. Oh, let's see if I can pop it there. We get this like awesome style of art, this classic pulpy art that like people just associate with the 80s. All of that comes out of TSR. Names like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, for people who are in the know, write some fantastic stories. But you also get like this spread of like Ravenloft, which is a big deal. So anyway, but during the 70s, and that's the important part, is like escapism takes a turn now to where it's not just gaming, but like you're role playing, which I think we take for granted a lot.
Yeah, I think as far as like the sit down and take direct control of the story kind of role playing is introduced here, because like you could put yourself in the shoes of Conan, but you would just be like sort of daydreaming and reenacting his events.
Yeah.
Same with like Lord of the Rings or Star Trek. You could escape into that world for a bit, but you'd be playing within that set parameter.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with D&D, yeah, it definitely opens it up to where you can craft your own Middle Earth, or your own starship, your own anything you want.
Yeah, I mean there certainly was like campaigns that you could buy, like Ravenloft, where you do the Curse of Strahd, I think it's known as Strahd von Zarovich, like a vampire controlled this gothic world. Like you could do that, but there was also like room for the first time to like a DM could build anything they wanted. And I think that level of immersion getting deeper becomes wildly important, because you're no longer like, if a video game, even though we're far off from video games, but most kind of escapist entertainment, it's like a roller coaster, right? It's a loop, it's a track, you can see the track, you can see it rise and fall, and like you're going to enjoy the ride, but you see it. Like, this is the first time where it's an open world. Like, the option to have an open world exploration with rules, like as far as like creatures and things and encounters, become open to you. And like, when's the next time we see that open world concept?
Sandbox, I think.
Sandbox gaming?
Yeah. Like
the early aughts of the 2000s, really? I mean, I guess you could say like maybe RuneScape.
More like Sims, maybe.
Yeah, or like probably like I think maybe 98, like early AOL games, which we'll talk about like later. But it's so far, it is literally like 30 years ahead of its time as far as like allowing people to kind of create their own worlds and create their own campaigns. And like Dungeons and Dragons becomes such a hit because like I think that freedom of like control and the ability to like be anybody. I mean, as AD&D comes out and the races get more diverse, your classes get more diverse, like whether dual classing, like you could be like a rogue and a thief, like you could be people you can't be in real life.
Yeah, it definitely introduces like a fluidity of identity.
Yeah,
like you can take on the role of whatever kind of, like, you don't have to just be a human.
Yeah,
you could be an elf, or you don't have to be even your own gender.
Yeah. And I think that like that amount of freedom to like move around in a character is so, especially like in the 70s of all times, where like everything just sucks. Like, there's no way to put it. The 70s were a terrible time, and I'm glad that I don't live in the 70s. Like, they had great music, but besides it, I don't know, man. I'm not feeling it. But D&D allowed people the choice to be who they wanted, and their outcomes affected the story. Like, it was more than just to choose your own adventure. It was like a step above that, and that really hadn't been seen before. This is a game where you could sit down, you could spend 8 hours at a table, right, with your friends, and still not be anywhere close to being done the story, or still have a thing to go to next. And I think that without D&D, without this existing in the world, a lot of entertainment that we have now and a lot of escapism that we have now would not exist again in the same way that we understand it and deal with it. Like we'll talk about it later, but Final Fantasy is like a base like its menus, its options, its like character class are all like again ripped from D&D. You know what I mean? But that becomes such a powerhouse through the 70s and the 80s as it becomes more accessible. Because like I said, when it first started out in the 70s, 74, 77, you had to be into miniature wargaming. You had to have chainmail. You had to have a place to go. It's not very like commercially out there. And we'll kind of jump into the 80s a little bit. But when AD&D comes out, it becomes more for the casual player. Because everyone else before, from 74 to 77, it was really appealing to those hardcore miniature wargaming fans. Which, if it would have just stayed there, it would have died. I guarantee you. Because, I mean, I don't miniature wargame. I think Warhammer is the next.
Yeah, Warhammer 40K. And yeah, that's still kind of out there as far as like the classic war games where it's like almost like chess, you know, knights and bishops and whatnot. Where Warhammer you have like space orcs.
Yeah.
So it's still a little bit out there, but
D&D is like you can be your person. You know, one of my guys is like one of my favorite characters I ever made was like Andy, who was like a warlock elf. And then I got to play Andy, and I got to play like my own great grandson because of the way elves work. It's hilarious. but like I could have continuity across two games. I had another game where I played this guy named Victor, who was just like started a crab cult. You know, crabs? Oh, yeah. But I had the freedom to like be all these people that I'm not in everyday life. I think like my warlock characters were like true neutral, and then the other one was like chaotic evil. The whole alignment chart itself, right? Things that I never was in real life. I think your character that you played that one time was like a wizard who was completely useless.
The completely useless like dwarf wizard who could just do really bad minor illusions.
Yeah, I think at one point you were a beach ball.
Yeah, trying to hide as a beach ball.
Yeah.
Just complete nonsense.
I mean, people still play D&D today. It is still strong. It's still well known. It's in like it's no longer a nerdy thing today, right? I think Netflix, like Stranger Things, has kind of elevated D&D. Like when people watch it, and people like it stopped being weird, it started being cool. You know, D&D used to be this thing, you know, where it's just like nerdy outcast kids would use it to cope, to feel senses of power, to feel empowered, and to live a life that, you know, was felt more or less denied to them. And that stereotype stuck around for a long time, even though like it appealed to a lot more than that base, but that's just kind of what I get stuck with. Which kind of leads me to the 80s portion, which is how it kickstarted, D&D kickstarted the satanic panic in the US. Yeah, so without getting into the weeds about satanic panic, which is like this direct leftover from McCarthyism, where it's like the Red Scare, but now it's just like the Satan scare that was going on. It starts off in Canada of all places with this book Michelle Remembers, which is more or less like a psychologist manipulating a woman with recovered memory therapy, and she starts remembering how she was kidnapped by this evil cult and like all of this. Anyway, so that book had just come out, and then it kind of dovetails in with James Egbert, who's this 15-year-old kid from Michigan, right? And 15 years old, super genius, is plucked from, you know, what would be his freshman year, and just thrown in, or his like sophomore year in high school, and all of a sudden he's at like Michigan State University, right? And he like starts playing D&D, it's like a way to cope. It becomes one of his things that he does. And then one day in 1979, he just disappears. No one knows where he's at, and the detective on the case like goes to the dorm room and is looking around, and he sees like these thumbtacks that are like in a certain in a row, and like he just assumes that these are a map of the steam tunnels below Michigan State University, and that James is like down there in the tunnels building a map for D&D. And that kind of evolves into like, well, or maybe like the group of Satanists got him. Or maybe like he started getting into the dark stuff with D&D. And there's this movie called Dark Dungeons, which is like, it's a so in the 80s, we're jumping a little bit ahead, but in the 80s they start with this like the resurgence of conservative values when Reagan gets elected, which is like, we'll talk about it in a minute, but there's this big like conservative Christian push, right? And they see things like Ozzy and all the heavy metal music, it's like satanic, right? And D&D gets lumped into that. And there's this movie called Dark Dungeons, which is like this Christian movie about two college students who basically lose their souls. Like one girl ends up killing herself because she gets so involved with D&D that she can no longer tell the difference between character and herself. And then the dungeon master of the group is like some legitimate satanic worshiper that's trying to get her to sell her soul, or have her do enough evil that she's like, isn't evil fun in the game? It's also fun in real life. Yeah, and it's just this ridiculous thing that we look at now, but it was such a big thing. Tom Hanks, his relation, he's in this movie that comes out in '82 called Mazes and Monsters. Yeah, it doesn't sound like Dungeons and Dragons at all, but different. It's also the same thing about a main character who gets so involved in D&D or Mazes and Monsters in this that they can no longer distinguish reality from the game, and the main character has a psychotic break in a cave, trying to very reminiscent of Egbert getting lost in the steam tunnels, which he wasn't, by the way. So Egbert just ran away. He was just a 15-year-old kid that was like, life is really hard and I'm depressed. And he just ran away.
No.
He didn't want to get caught. I mean, it does have a sad ending where he does end up committing suicide a year later. But I mean, what do you expect from taking a 15-year-old kid, taking him out of a normal, growth of being around his own peers to just throwing him into college? It's figure it out. But yeah, D&D becomes this product of escaping, giving bringing power to yourself. It becomes a very big deal, especially for people that feel powerless. It is the invention of tabletop RPGs, tabletop role-playing games, which the role-playing model is now such a prevalent thing in today. It's hard, we just take it for granted. For Skyrim or anything by Bethesda, Fallout, where you can customize, you are your character. And we just it's just a natural part of how we game. But its birthplace is in D&D. Its birthplace is in the 70s. Its birthplace is in miniature wargaming, and its evolution is tracked by the players who got involved, those people who wanted to feel a sense of power, to have these epic adventures. A lot of modern day gaming is brought back to D&D. That immersion, again, it becomes very important. Also, hilariously enough, it says in Game Wizards, which is a definitive history of D&D, in its like evolution. Mostly about how TSR, the company that Gary Gygax founded, and how Gary Gygax is like not a business person, which is it's this whole like comedy of errors. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is it appealed to more people, how it evolved, how the gaming evolved, how the concepts of like character development evolved, like how much we owe in modern gaming to D&D is outrageous. And it all starts in the 70s, 74. Also in the 70s, all right, so D&D, you had to buy into it. You had like that. Its shortcomings, especially in the beginning, was like its accessibility. You had to know the miniature wargaming. You had to buy these expensive manuals. You had to have friends to play with, who are also committed to being there for 11 hours of their life. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but D&D tends to go into the wee hours of the night. There was a lot of buy-in. You also had to be good at math.
It was very niche, very investment heavy kind of thing.
Yes, but in 1977, a movie hits the screen that requires none of the above. No math, no friends, no friends. By this very new on the scene director, George Lucas. He comes out with this movie called Star Wars. And Star Wars gets very big for a lot of reasons. One of the big reasons is like the 70s suck, and they're just a gut punch every time you turn on any kind of anything. Can't listen to the radio or turn on the television without seeing Vietnam or
energy
crises, because there's two. Nice. Right? And what you get is Star Wars, which is this epic movie that blends Western, science fiction, space opera. It is a movie. I got to talk to a lot of people about their experiences. A lot of people that were like actually around for when Star Wars came out in theaters, and like a lot of people said the same thing. Is like what took them is no one had ever seen anything like it. Between like the special effects and the practical effects of the movie. Like, I mean, you like at the time it was like Star Wars and Smokey and the Bandit. So science fiction really wasn't a big thing right now, right? So a lot of things were Western movies. A lot of things were, like Smokey and the Bandit, like kind of like it wasn't
more based in reality.
Yeah, it was heavily based in the here and the now. So and science fiction was kind of like on a downswing anyway. So like it wasn't very like those kind of things weren't super popular, right? And then Star Wars comes along and just blows up. I mean, the question like I interviewed a guy named Tom who was he's in one of my classes who he was 9 years old when Star Wars came out. He was like, it wasn't, are you going to see Star Wars? It was, how many times have you seen Star Wars? Because it's also important to realize, like, here at the technology, like, there's VCRs aren't a thing yet, or, like, VHSs, movie rentals. So, like, once the thing was in theaters, once it was left theaters, it was gone. Just, like, into the ether. Which is a weird concept to think about today. Like, can you imagine, like, yeah, if you don't go see, if you don't see Batman The Dark Knight, it's gone. Like, you'll never see it again.
It's not on Netflix. You can't watch it online.
There is no Netflix. Yeah. You gotta watch it. It's gonna disappear. And it introduced this like space opera that I think it held two kind of narratives I think were really important. You had like the King Arthur, the Chosen One narrative with like Luke. So you had that, and then right alongside it, you had Han Solo, the anti-hero. And so I think like pairing these two together was such an amazing choice by George Lucas. But it was an exciting, fast-paced film with massive special effects that had not been seen before. And I think it also, at a time where those traditional nuclear family values, that atomic family, you know, when those are being tested, Star Wars appealed to everybody. Whether you were just a kid and thought it was the coolest special effects and the lightsaber sword fights, or there was that like background of like the political drama with you know, the Empire and Darth Vader, and like again we're coming out of World War II, so like a lot of like visualization, like there's freaking stormtroopers, for God's sakes, you know what I mean? So there was a lot of like design in there that was really seated in public consciousness. So the movie appealed to everybody. And as far as world building goes, they were looking again. So like with every good movie comes toys, right? And this little company called Kenner ends up getting like the rights for toy making. I think this is genius and help spread the universe. Was George Lucas let Kenner just make shit up? Vehicles, they call them like off screens. Basically, it allowed for the universe to grow organically, where a toy company can be like, oh yeah, see this vehicle and like these little guys. So like kids were already building this like little universe with things that were both on screen and off screen. So like it really helped expand the world of Star Wars. And I mean, again, the Star Wars universe is like Star Trek. It's a freaking universe. So many things can happen, and it's not just like toys and books in the movies, but between all three of those things, like artists and authors build off of it. So you could go anywhere, and I think that was important, as people could get lost in all different parts of the universe touched by the Empire. I don't know. I think that was a genius way to market and to deal with these things. So, Walter Cronkite had said, George Lucas's Star Wars lifted us out of our depression of the 70s and into an awesomeness and focus on space and its possible future. The movie stood by itself. So kind of like with Star Trek, it gave people kind of like breathed new life into possibilities for the future. Like Cronkite said, it breathed life into the idea that like things suck now, but look how great they could get.
Yeah, there aren't that many forward-looking kind of forms of escapism. Like Lord of the Rings is, you know, almost like medieval, based in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Godzilla kind of based in the here and now, but a little bit back in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, it's in the name.
True.
It's in the past.
But it gave people something exciting to think about. You know, it brought spaceships back and made them cool. You know what I mean? It brought back the idea of being the rebel for like the just cause, and made it cool. And I think that helped. You know, that's why Star Wars is still around today. I think is like those things that it touches on again are like timeless. It's the same trope.
Yeah.
But as far as like the small collection of good guys against the overwhelming odds of like the evil empire, and I feel like a lot of people could identify with a lot, and I think the diversity of characters allowed people to identify with different parts of Star Wars, whether you wanted to be the anti-hero or the naive, like, you know, chosen one, or you know, or Chewbacca. You want to be the 7 foot tall, like wildebeest that just rips people apart. Sam Squanch, you know?
Yeah, that's me.
Wow. Listen. So yeah, that kind of like wraps up the 70s portion. But like out of the 70s, I think Dungeons and Dragons and Star Wars become like the two cultural touchstones, like as far as like what we build modern day escapism and fantasy off of.
And I think they both draw 1-to-1s with Dungeons and Dragons, directly, obviously, ripped almost word for word from Lord of the Rings, and Star Wars being comparable to Star Trek from that time too.
Yep. And I think it's important to keep that technology aspect in mind as we barrel into the 80s. Wow. The 1980s. Wow. Like, we talk about, like, technology and escapism and, like, the explosion of struggling to keep up with shit. The 80s is where that happens. Right? Because before, when it was like, you had movies, you had books, you had tabletop gaming. Now you have like this whole new technology that's like video gaming.
A combination of all.
It's a combination of everything. So this is like where it becomes really hard to keep up with what's important. Because so many like cultural escapist touchstones happen in the 80s, right? And we cannot get to all or any of, well, we'll get to a few of them, but we cannot get to all of them. I mean, hell, you'd have like Star Trek: The Next Generation just by itself, right? And all of the other Star Wars is coming out. Like, things start to get layered. But like, what's happening in the 80s, right? So we got the Doomsday Clock, right? We got tensions with the Soviet Union really starting to mount up. We're having technology become more and more accessible. Like, the bar to access technology is getting lower. Like, it's becoming more accessible. We have the AIDS crisis. We have Satanic Panic, which we talked about before. We have the subculture war. We have the rise of Christian conservatism, or just like conservatism in general. The breakdown of the nuclear family. We have Reaganomics. We got video games, VCRs, movie rentals, the Atari 2600, Nintendo, arcade cult, like mall culture, which I left out. There's an explosion of absolutely everything in the 80s. So like, picking what becomes important to look at is like really hard as far as like evolutions and escapism, because there's a lot to choose from. But I think I'll start with one of the most important, I think, is 1982's Blade Runner. Classic. Again, this is a film I don't think you would watch before this program, or before we like started this. No, right? But I mean, it stars Harrison Ford, handsome man from Star Wars. Still, the same with the birth of cyberpunk and Blade Runner, right? Cyberpunk becomes this brand new genre that starts like burgeoning out as we grapple with like technology and who has access to what technology. This idea that like corporations are going to become more powerful than the government. The term high tech, low life becomes a big deal, which kind of sums it up, right? Like, everybody's access to these amazing technologies is like at your fingertips, but like life in general has not gotten any better or easier. And I feel like in some ways the cyberpunk birth through like Blade Runner, I feel like they got a lot right on accident, right? Like this whole idea of like a world just aesthetically that has been like taken over by corporations. And I feel like you see that like just outright, like just branding everywhere. Like I think in the film, there's a lot of those like neon signs where it's like advertisement. And like, in what way is that different than today?
Like when Samsung put up that giant ad over Notre Dame while they were recording.
Notre Dame, sponsored by Samsung.
Yeah, they had a giant sign advertising their new phones on there.
Yeah, and so cyberpunk is like this reaction to new technologies and the power of the corporations behind them. And I think like that is one of those things that are super important to look at, because like while films like Star Wars and television shows like Star Trek, like has everything already firmly planted in the future. Cyberpunk and Blade Runner, which Blade Runner is a adaptation of Philip K. Dick's "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep," which kind of roughly follows the same thing, where the main character is like trying to track down, um, you know, androids who, you know, look like are almost indistinguishable from humans. Right. That's the premise of Blade Runner is like Harrison Ford is a Blade Runner, a guy who specifically goes out, tracks down androids because androids are synths, like synthetic humans. They're so much more powerful than humans. They're stronger, they're more adaptive, and so to like kind of combat this, they're given a 4-year lifespan, so they can't learn too much. And they just die. It's like our insurance, because we basically do the whole thing where we make them more human than human, and the only like insurance we have is that in 4 years they just shut down and die. In Blade Runner, you have these renegade synths, or like, you know, I keep calling them synths because of Fallout. But the point is like they don't want to die. Kind of like in a very interesting like callback to like Frankenstein's monster. Right, like who want to search for their own meaning. Like one of the main you know, android there goes to try to like you know, reclaim his life, trying to make sure that he doesn't disappear. He wants more than that 4-year lifespan. Like he sees the universe and goes, you know what, I want more of that. So but Deckard, which is Harrison Ford's character, has to, you know, hunt him down and shut him down. And like the moral quandary of like, how do you, like, here you have this guy who just wants to live, and he's not being allowed to. He's being denied his life. So I think the Blade Runner introduces these old concepts that we see in like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein about like what does it mean to be human. It also blends the whole like technology, who has access to it, can we build something that is like, you know, something that becomes a threat to us. To me it's a very interesting
reminiscent of Godzilla.
It is. And again, I feel like when you stack all these films on top of each other, it's almost scary how like not scary, but it's interesting like how close they all are together,
or how they kind of predict the other, I suppose.
Yeah. So you have Blade Runner, which becomes this like noir cyberpunk, but it's not set that far in the future, and I think that's what makes cyberpunk different than like Star Trek or Star Wars, which are like hundreds of years away. Like cyberpunk is always like within 50 years of today. It's always like in that very near future. And I think that's so appealing in escapism because it allows us to see remnants of our recognizable world in these, you know, future settings. And like there's games like Shadowrunner, which is a tabletop RPG that comes out in the 80s that is based off of cyberpunk. Right? So it's like D&D but cyberpunk. It spawns its own, you know, genre that lasts all the way up to today. Like, for example, Cyberpunk's 2077, which we'll talk about.
Not too far in the future.
Not too far in the future. Yeah, it's always just ahead of us. But the idea of, like, again, high tech, low life. Like, today, we have our cell phones in our pockets. We have literally access to the entire world, like, right here. And yet, I'm not, like, I'm not eating any better. You know what I mean? Like, what does it mean to have all these, like, technologies and have all of this, like, you know, incredible advancements, but it doesn't really change your quality of living. as far as like I'm not eating better. Like the world isn't in a necessarily it hasn't, what do you call it? It's not one of those worlds where like we have the technology to make sure everybody can eat and everything can, we have, you know, access to, like, we can make it so there's clean water, clean air, we can make sustainable practices. We have all this technology, but the people who control purse strings, who control money, who controls access to it, are the corporations. I don't know. I think it's just very echoey of today. And cyberpunk is such a recognizable genre. It's in the 80s too. It's like seeing how fantastic things can get, like with, you know, like Neuromancer, which came out in 84, which was starting to be written before Blade Runner came out. But the idea of like plugging into the internet, visiting cyberspace, hacking the mainframe, VR, yeah, it's all these things that become like a reality, or our reality now, but just like not in the way that we thought it would be. So cyberpunk becomes really a really important genre that's born out of that early 80s time. I mean, and there's also Akira, which is it's a series that gets written in Japan. Like again, so America and Japan, we become like we become very close as far as like
via gun.
Yeah, right. We become very close economically, and we become like each other's trading partners, and we start, you know, importing a lot of Japanese culture. Like anime is big now, it's mainstream now, but it wasn't always. And I think one of the very first films that broke through anime was Akira.
I do remember it being compared to Blade Runner.
Yeah,
like the Japanese version of Blade Runner.
Yeah. It's the same concept where you have a world that's destroyed, Japan that's destroyed by what they believe is a nuclear bomb that destroys old Tokyo. Now you have Neo Tokyo, and you know, the world it has these amazing technologies, but like most of the people live in slums. Like gang violence is like what happens. You know what I mean? So it's like only the top of the triangle, you know, get access to the good of living. Everyone else is just, in a way of like Reaganomics, like trickle down, like just trying to survive off of it. And these aesthetics, so even though it's not necessarily like in Tolkien where it's like, oh, you know, so clear cut between good and bad and corruption, like in these kind of escapist worlds, like you still have to like get a little dirty to survive. You know what I mean? Like it's not as black and white, but it's still like a fantasy that you can escape into. It's still a place you can go.
Yeah, you can almost like not a springboard, but use it as like a mirror to reflect on what we currently have going.
Yeah,
I think that's why it's definitely picking up more recently, like with the revival of Ready Player One.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it was such a Ready Player One came out in 2011, but the movie. Like, tell me you don't look at the stacks and you can't see Ohio, or like places getting so overcrowded with people that we're just like stacking.
Or like how New York right now has an insane infestation problem because there's just so many people generating so much trash in this small area.
Yeah, and that you see that in Blade Runner, right? It's like already kind of calling it out where like the trash is over there, like the big smog, like it's just perpetual smog from like all the trash in the industry. Like people burning so much, it's like, oh, is it foggy? No, it's just the air is like this. Like the idea that like a city itself could be like statewide, like a mega city. And like again, I feel like in a way that's kind of predicting the future with like the expansion of the urban environment. And it's like I feel like it's calling out to a time where it's like pretty soon you'll just have like these dedicated lands for farming. You know what I mean? Like we'll take the Midwest, for example. Like all the Midwest, like we're just growing food there now. Everything else is a city, but no more houses, no more industry. It's like their job is to just grow food until we make synthetic food,
which we can do for meat now. We can do synthetic meat.
Yeah, And like once we are able to like synthesize certain foods and proteins to sustain, like does it even matter? We could have a continent-wide megacity. You know, and I think these are the extremes I think Tolkien was writing about and what he was like afraid of with industry. No more greenery unless it's like, you know, through VR or seen. In Blade Runner, there are no animals. They're all synthetic. They're all designed like in a lab, and you can purchase them. You know, these androids, these like synths, they are the ones that do all the big manual heavy labor because they're stronger than humans. Like with in the very opening of the movie, Leon, the guy who's getting Voight comped, and they're like trying to figure out, and he's just like, what does he do all day? He loads 400-pound nuclear weapons all day. That's all he does, 24/7. Like, tell me that's not like, we already have robots that are what do you call it? Taking over a machine, like manual labors now.
Like the assembly lines for cars.
Yeah. I keep calling them synths. I know they're replicants, but the Lex, because I grew up in like the time of the Fallout, was my first experience. Because I never was a science fiction person or like a cyberpunk person. Like that was not my. I was right there with Tolkien and right there with well, not Conan, but like fantasy was my thing. Sword and sorcery, high fantasy. So like I guess because even though they're replicants, I keep calling them synths because Fallout is imprinted on my brain. So like I know the replicants. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's just like that's where my head is completely at. But yeah, so you have this like reactionary idea of like, you know, in the 80s, this is the time of 24-hour news. This is the time of like technology booms, and it's like, who has access? What is the future gonna look like? And I feel like cyberpunk is this like quasi dystopian world where only the haves get the good stuff, and the haves not just get the leftover and the trickle down. And I think that's really really important because it affects, you know, today, like with everything that's happening today, like being the inheritors of, you know, all the bad decisions from Reagan in the 80s and the shitstorm of the early aughts and the recession of 2008, and like I feel of that like idea of that, well, maybe corporations do have more control. Like I feel like that dystopianism is alive and well, and I think out of all the things that have been passed down to us, I think right now in this current time, cyberpunk hits the hardest.
I would 100% agree with that. VR is definitely becoming more prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
Even advertising in VR space.
Yep.
Technology is widely accessible, and corporations definitely have their advertising fingers all over, like, literally everything.
Yeah. I mean, some people are just like brand loyalists now, and I think a lot of that comes back to the 80s, and it's unreal to me how much they got wrong. Except we don't have like cool flying cars.
Cool flying cars would make it better.
I mean, we do have flying cars; they're just not accessible.
Not yet. Not
yet. But I think as we get into 2000s, we come back to Ready Player One. I think, which is like again, the child of the cyberpunk movement of the 80s. You get Ready Player One, and like other likewise games. But like modern technology and escapism, like the idea of like being so immersive, you know, like you can just slide on a visor and be in the world. Like that idea gets hatched in the 80s and becomes a reality in the 2000s. 20 years. Someone saw that and was like, I can do that.
Kind of makes you wonder though a little bit. That old phrase, "life imitates art."
Yeah.
Kind of echoes a little bit too hard with the cyberpunk genre.
Oh, yeah. I mean, also in the 80s, it's important is like the escapism evolves in the sense that like we now have arcades. which was a big deal. I think it was what 9 trillion. No, in 1981, 9 billion quarters alone were spent on the arcade scene. That's a lot of. I don't know. That's a lot.
Yeah, 25 cents then I think was about $1 now.
It was not just huge for like the industry, but like it became a space. Like the arcade movement became a space where like you could go with your friends, and you could like disappear into like video games as a communal thing, you know, and that has its heyday for like up until the home consoles get introduced. Like so, like just to cover that, like video gaming starts to getting big. I mean, you have the crash of video games in the late '80s with the abomination that was E.T. And they were like, well, because they like video games were being pumped out by anyone and everyone that wanted to make money, and this was like before reviews, right? Again, this is everything here is still word of mouth and like calling your friends, you know. But you had no idea whether a game was good or not, and so like that led to this oversaturation where people were pumping out total trash, and it led to the video game market crash where we were like, oh, video games are done forever. Then you have home consoles, so no longer you didn't even have to like go to an arcade anymore to play games with friends. You didn't even have, like you could sit at home and not spend quarters, right? So we had like the Atari 2600, which is like if you've ever seen the blocks of the Atari, you still need some imagination. But if you compare Atari to like Galaga in the arcade cabinet, the graphics were like you couldn't even equate them. You could not equate graphics between arcade cabinets, which had bigger technology and like you know more hefty stuff under the hood to run it, and like what you could get off of a game cartridge. Until technology catches up and we're able to refine it, and all of a sudden now the graphics that you get in the arcade and what you can get on your Nintendo Entertainment System are almost comparable. Then you just start going over to friends' houses, so then the arcade scene kind of dies. But then you have things like this, like the Game Boy Advance, where you could actually like have full games in your pocket. Like technology starts picking up, and that starts changing how we deal with escapism. So this video gaming is the new thing.
You know what's interesting is starting off like in the beginning, almost like an evolution of escapism, coming full circle. It's like it starts off with Conan and Lord of the Rings, where you know where Conan it's like your own small circle,
yeah,
right? Like your just local area.
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings expands to like you know like a friend group, and then it just keeps expanding with Godzilla, you know, the national group, and then it kind of comes back around in the '80s, where that escapism is like the local or like a widespread group friends at the arcade, and then kind of narrows down to your like close friend group coming home, and then you know with VR it's even smaller where like that immersion is applicable really only to you, not those around you.
Yeah. Well, that's until, and we'll come back to it, until you get the internet and mobile, or not mobile, into the online gaming, and then it starts like you can be physically in one space, but then like dealing with people all over the world, like that kind of connection, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, but I see what you're saying about like the loop there. But we have, like I said, like we have video games, right? But we still have like the graphic novel, the comic book, which is another interesting avenue. There's a lot of stuff in the 80s that I think were really applicable, but I think out of all of them, that really spoke to the times, Watchmen and V for Vendetta stick out above the rest. Watchmen is kind of blurs the line between good and evil and really speaks to that unknowingness about, you know, the Cold War and the Doomsday Clock. I mean, the Doomsday Clock is like the symbol of the whole franchise, right? And the idea of like how far are you willing to go to save the world, right? I mean, in Watchmen, these Minutemen superheroes start disappearing one by one, and by disappearing, I mean getting murdered, and they're like trying to figure out like who's murdering all these people. Spoiler alert: it's another superhero, Ozymandias, who again, he is the 1%, right? Out of all the superheroes who are more or less like normal people, Ozymandias is like the rich, wealthy guy. He's like Elon Musk.
Who, Batman.
Yeah, but his plan is to save the world by destroying it. Like he's gonna build this machine that like sucks aliens to Earth and makes it so we have to band together so we don't destroy ourselves by nuclear weapons. So it takes this play of like, you know, it kind of speaks to the time with like how dire people were feeling, right? Like how like the tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union were so high. It was like trying to live under the constant threat of like we could just blow each other up tomorrow. So it's
like now,
yeah,
the
like
tensions between us and Russia.
Oops. Yeah, I don't think we really moved on, but it's like that idea of how far are we willing to go? Like, is it going to take something like aliens for us to band together? You know what I mean? And say, well, let's come together as a species. I don't know. So Watchmen really kind of stuck out to me for that reason. Was it really spoke to, I think, the tensions of in the midst of the Cold War, like what needs to happen that we stop this. And in the end, it turned out we needed, at least in Watchmen, alien invasion. Like he's destroyed like 9 cities or something like that. It was insane. And then V for Vendetta, I think, is classic because it also loops her back around to like fascism. Like how much security are you willing to like how much of your liberties are you willing to give up for like safety? Like the world of V for Vendetta is populated by, you know, the world has torn itself apart, and England kind of like retains its autonomy only because it is this like nationalized like fascism that is like a stranglehold where everything is controlled, what you watch, what you your job, everything is like regulated by the government. Like how far are you willing to go? And it calls into question, you know, V, the main character, you know, kind of overthrows that government by poking holes and fracturing like the iron grip that fascism has. But again, like I feel like during in the 80s, you know, when you have like the Troubles with all the bombings from the IRA and everything like going like that, you know, you have all the you know, uncertainty going on. Like I guarantee you, people were like, well, we can give up certain rights, certain freedoms if it means like we get to live to see tomorrow, or we don't have to worry about this. You know, and it's like that slippery slope of like, how much do you sacrifice? You know, and we had that in the 2000s with the Patriot Act and all of that other stuff that went on like after the 9/11, where it was like, well, how much of our freedoms are we going to give up? Like, what are we willing to sacrifice so a terrorist attack doesn't happen? You know what I mean? Like, who do we paint as the bad guy? And I think out of the 80s, like, that becomes, like, a big thing. It's like, if you, like, imagine, like, I guess we don't have to imagine because it's like that now, right? Where it's like, could blow up at any minute. Like, everyone has nukes now. Oops. Like, how do you deal with that? And I think these are good escapist fantasies of, like, again, maybe not the cheeriest things, where it shows us, like, maybe aliens, you know what I mean?
Maybe
like,
aliens will come.
Yeah.
Break the city down. It'll be fine.
The Watchmen isn't necessarily a world I'd like to escape into, but, like, it's a good time capsule that captures the spirit of the time. So, I mean, in the 80s, we have all these things going on between, like, again, the rise of cyberpunk, the rise of the internet, the accessibility of technology, cable television, like it becomes this very like influx time between like when Reagan comes in as president, and that push of like conservative Christian values, the war on drugs, like the war on the poor. It becomes a time again that's really unique and spawns some really unique things. And again, we have video games. I forgot we had Final Fantasy to talk about too, which is like one of those franchises that comes out only for the console, because we talked about how it moved away from the arcade, where in the arcade you had to play by quarters, so like certain like narrative based stories you couldn't do. You wouldn't have enough money to play through. But when you bring the consoles home, things like Final Fantasy, which is like this big epic story about like saving the world by relighting like the 5 crystals of the elements, 4 crystals of the elements. You couldn't really do that before, and now you can. And a lot of like the classes, the cleric, the fighter, the monk, like all of that becomes ripped off of from D&D. But we only got there through the evolution of technology, through like video games being here to stay, and then we follow that trail right through D&D and fantasy. You get back to Conan, you get back to Tolkien in Middle Earth. The through line I think is very easy to see. How everything kind of stacks up on top of each other and continues to build these worlds of fantasy that we're still feeling today. So, I mean, a lot happened in the 80s, and I feel like we could also hone in on just one thing. And that's what I hate about like dealing with this topic and like having to keep everything in like a brevity is really impossible, because I feel with every niche, every like branch that you bring up, like we could be down this rabbit hole for like days. There was a 5-hour documentary on just the 80s alone as far as arcade culture. Not even home consoles, not the time, not anything. Just like on arcade culture. 5 hours. God damn.
Well, we can compress that.
Can we? Which I guess we're, now that we're going to be moving out of the 80s, we're leaving behind, the new technology, video games, where the internet's just burgeoning. Like, we have cyberpunk, this genre that gets birthed about the tensions between, again, high tech, low life, corporations being in control, having more power than the government. All these wonderful things, and all, but also like the shitstorm that comes with it, which will lead us into a time that we knew and grew up in, which is the early 2000s. Kind of making it like to compress time, as because I know this is long already. We had to like cut out the 90s, right? Which sucks. We have like Pokemon. We have all those other kind of things that become cornerstones, but some things had to get cut out, or else we'd be here longer than we already are. We just don't have that time for that. We'd be here for years and years. So we're going to be moving right on to the 2000s. So we're finally at the 2000s. My God, it's been a slog. If you're still here, why? But here we are. How technology... Now, this is a point where I feel like technology, its integration with escapism and storytelling become more interweaved than, watching a movie. Because now we have access to the internet. Now the internet becomes more accessible as the 90s and 2000s happen, and how we decide to play games and how we decide to enter these stories and these worlds change. So I guess it's like where to start, and I like MMORPGs. So now we're moving from like tabletop RPGs to playing with your friends, like online. Which, if you're gonna go like to when that started, the first earliest recording we have of it is like 1991, Neverwinter Nights. It is the first MMORPG. It's a Dungeons and Dragons. So again, here Dungeons and Dragons is coming out ahead of the curve. But it has its own snags, right? So you have to, like, number one, have a computer with access to the internet and deep pockets.
Oh, yeah, because internet providers charged
Yes.
by the hour, I think.
Yeah, so this is like when internet was still trying to figure out. It was like EA Sports, it's like, so it was $12 adjusted for inflation. It was $12 an hour to play Neverwinter Nights online. Yeah, so and this is like when it blocked up the phone line. So how many hours you were playing with friends to like clear a dungeon. And it was still, and Neverwinter Nights is the first, like, graphics. Like, I'm not going to count text-based, because that would put us back in the 70s, or 80s at least, with, like, text-based gaming. So, like, the first, like, with graphics and you can see what's happening is Neverwinter Nights. It's not until 1997 with Ultima that you get the first commercially successful MMORPG. And even then, it's still not as well known as World of Warcraft.
Everybody knows WoW.
WoW is a blending of high fantasy, sword and sorcery, and it's done through, I guess, it's almost like a cyberpunk way where you can, you're doing it all online. So
you do have more of like a, maybe not, you got not just like explicitly cyberpunk, but there's definitely like some of the tropes of the high-tech low life can be seen in like certain dwarven cities, or like ruined.
Yeah. Because the internet like brings all of this together, and like because technology has changed so rapidly, you have so many people who grew up on one technology coexisting. So like people who loved Blade Runner in the 80s and 82 are adults now that are, maybe they saw it as kids and they're like thinking how freaking cool this is, or how, and WoW came out in 2004. So like that's the most commercially successful, and I think WoW dwarfs in sales any other, or not just sales, but like people subscribe to playing, because it was a subscription-based game. So it's like not only did you have to buy the CD-ROM, and your computer had to have memory, but like you had to like subscribe to it every month to continue to play. But anyway, like it did better, and it still like holds the record for like most subscribed online players. I think it was like at its best, it had like 150,000 active players on it. Insane. So like in 2004, the future of gaming, like this like element where you can create your own character, you can create your own race, and you're like, or you can be whatever race is there, like your options of like who you can become. It's just like it's like D&D but online and with everybody. The online portion of like the storytelling, where it's like now you can like talk to anybody anywhere all over the world.
It's also got a lower bar for entry as far as knowledge of the RPG.
Yeah,
like you don't have to have like super in-depth knowledge on like character building or stat balancing or anything like that, because it's kind of taken care of for you behind the scenes.
Yeah. And I think like that part of like gaming becomes very important, and that MMORPG, that formula branches off, because like I feel like when we get to like the rise of technology to a certain point, we have different ways we can go. We can go console and PC. Like those two technologies become very important for escapism and immersion because they both offer different things, I feel.
In the early 2000s, yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of... the lines are kind of blurred today.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely back then, because consoles weren't really connected to the internet, or didn't have as much internet accessibility as PCs did, obviously.
Yeah.
So your experience was more like either single player or local with friends at your house. It was very self-contained, where I think the PC definitely opened it up to literally the whole world.
Yeah. And that World of Warcraft was just like an advancement of like, so you could play these like stories, these linear stories, like, you know, destroy the bad guy, you know what I mean, kind of deal. But you could co-op with like anybody from anywhere. Like the birth of like guilds or clans, you know, things that are still around today. As far as like, and here we are like almost 20 years later. Like to clan up with somebody, to be in a guild, like to go raiding, these things that are in our lexicon, just like dungeon crawling, comes back to like this MMO, this massive multiplayer online role playing game. Wow. So I think technology definitely has its starts blurring the line between immersion and like even with console gaming. I think in the early 2000s, it's important to look at the world and like what's happening worldwide, and we talk about the global war on terror, especially here, and its rise of first-person shooter games to come out of like this big push. I mean, I know that like the government, the DoD funded like the SOCOM games, the SEAL Team 6 games, like these military games become wildly important, especially among military-aged males who are going to be around enlisting age. So like how video games start becoming tools of propaganda in the early 2000s. So like
insertion of propaganda into the escapism.
Yeah, I mean
it's almost like Cyberpunk warned us about that.
Oh no, but I mean that it's really real. Like the whole SOCOM franchise gets money from the DoD to you can be a SEAL and go on these missions. Medal of Honor, the same way. They get funding from the DoD to play their games. And like, I don't know, there's just something gross about that. I don't think Call of Duty was. I think Call of Duty is its own thing, but like, the whole rise of these first-person shooting games in tandem with the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, that is like, they say it's over, but it's still, people are still over there. Like, how many people went down that path because they had exposure to Call of Duty? I mean, it was a recruiting thing, or it was like, oh, you want to play Call of Duty in real life? Like, that, that kind of saturation into, like, recruiting lexicons. Like, at one point, the Army was passing out that CD-ROM, where it was like, oh gosh, what was it? Like, you could play it, and it was like you just played like this Army, like, private.
Oh yeah. Where it was like you went through like the basic training, like the basic shooting training.
Yeah, I mean, so it became a tool for recruitment. Like, gaming became such a staple. I mean, and I think today, like, that is our modality of immersion. Like, most people are more likely to play a video game, to go play Grand Theft Auto, to go play Fallout, to go play Overwatch, than they are to pick up a book and go, I want to go, go on an adventure here in the stacks. So, I mean, the technology has definitely informed our method of escapism. It certainly did, like, growing up. Like, when we were growing up, we had the Xbox, playing Halo 2. I think that was a big deal. And Halo was, like, one of the first games to really do the whole access the internet to, like, do PvP matches. Where you could, like, just shoot at other real people, like, not real people, but like you could play against real people. In those like arena type games, which I mean isn't new. I mean you could used to be able to like do those kind of shooters with like Turok 2 and the N64, but you weren't playing against like actual people on the other end. You're playing the computer. But like you could go on those like team death matches, which became huge in the 2000s.
Which, funny enough, isn't really too different from those tabletop war games. Player versus player.
Yeah. I mean, you also get StarCraft 2, StarCraft in general, which I think StarCraft is more like the tabletop games where it's like you control these units to do this one thing, and you're kind of like the mastermind behind like putting units here and there and, you know, fighting around. But like, I mean, esports becomes a thing. You know what I mean? Like, esports is like, there are stadiums that get filled and like esports players get paid massive amounts of money.
Yeah, they play for $1 million+ prize pools.
Yeah, so like to the point where like escapism in video games have become like a job for some people. Is this interesting evolution where it was like before it's like I'm going here to like you go in this virtual world, squeeze off a couple rounds in the first person shooter, and all of a sudden it's your job to play Call of Duty. It's your job to play Overwatch. I'm sorry, it never happened for you.
I got close.
I was almost there.
I was almost so close.
Oh. But like, you know, that kind of genre gets birthed in the 2000s. And I really think that the rise of like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty is very much in line with like we're at war, Iraq, Afghanistan, like continuing to like feed, you know, not so much violence, but like I don't know. I guess
it's definitely like a reflection of what's going on at the time. Like, like with Conan, seeing the rough and tumble might makes right world is directly reflected in Conan. So it would, or like with today's shooters, there are not many like new space shooters. The space shooters are coming back, but not like. I'm gonna cut this whole part out. My train of thought just completely left me.
Yeah, no, I kind of see. I kind of get what you're getting at.
There's more shooters that are grounded in like the Middle East or Europe or anything like that. Like that market is like super heavily saturated for shooters, and I think that's because it's a direct reflection of recent times.
Well, think of Call of Duty. How much of Call of Duty takes place in like Africa or the Middle East?
Like every game.
Yeah.
like every game.
Yeah. And it kind of, I mean, I feel like in that way it's toxic because it reinforces these places as like dangerous places that you don't want to go to, you know what I mean? Like I feel like the next rendition of Call of Duty will probably take place in China. Like it's just, because that's how that genre kind of evolved. But then we get back to like, you know, as technology gets better and immersion gets better and becoming part of stories, right? Sandbox gaming, Elder Scrolls, Minecraft. I think some of the big ones again are like, especially post recession, where people are starting to opt for. So like after like 2008, and after that you know depression hits, I feel like a lot of gaming switches to like full immersion. Like not just like the first person shooters or like the linear tracks where you have these like defined story arc in the game. But people start opting for these like completely different worlds where you are totally like immersed in your character. Whether it's like Morrowind, Oblivion, or like Skyrim, which I think it's still my favorite out of all of them, even though I grew up on Morrowind and really loving that. I think Skyrim is the really one that did it for me with like the graphics and the pulling you in. And then you have like Fallout. So you can pick your flavor of sandbox, right? Like you can go Fallout 3, Fallout 4, where that's the console versions where you're, you know, in these like either nuclear radiated worlds and you kind of have freedom to build your character how you want. And you transverse like a world that's devastated by nuclear weapons, right? And then you get like the MMO version, which is like Fallout 76, which like is a big deal for you know, going through West Virginia, you know what I mean? and just like living out like just a few years after that, and you get to team up with friends and you're playing with friends, and you can like have this Fallout experience together and like build these like. What's crazy to me is like you can build like a whole settlement in Fallout 76 in these MMOs, log in and it's still there.
You know, unless somebody destroys it.
Unless somebody destroys, yeah, and then you can get like the whole players doing evil to do evil, but like it's like just you get to like be in this space and control it yourself. I mean, same thing like Bethesda's huge with that. Same thing with Skyrim. You want to go the more like fantasy route, you can, you know, you're the Dragonborn. You know what I mean? You're in the war between the elves and the Nords, or you have access to all these different races, Khajiits, Argonians, Tamriel. The world of Skyrim is so big that you can be anywhere, like within Elder Scrolls Online. Like you can go to other planes. Like the immersion factor is huge. But then like you have on your console Skyrim or Oblivion, and you can just be in your little lane and exist in one part of the world. And then you have like the Western version with like Red Dead Redemption. So like it's like, where do you want? Like now the technology in the consumer market is really informing storytelling, where it's like, what world do you want to get lost in? You want to get lost in the Western? You want to get lost in the fantasy world? You want to go to like a post-apocalyptic space? Like we now have these options to get completely immersed and lost in here. Like I have so many hours in Skyrim, it's embarrassing. Right? Like, I think I have, like, years of time. It's been out since 2011, but I guarantee you, if you added up all the time I've had in Skyrim, it's years. It's dead ass. And I never get bored, because there's something to do.
Yeah, I feel the same way with Genshin, even though it only came out, like, a couple of years ago.
Yeah, explain Genshin, because that's another one.
Yeah, no, it's just, like, another fantasy world that I wouldn't classify it as an MMO, but it's definitely like a single player cooperative hybrid where you can team up with other people if you want to do certain tasks, like fight certain bosses, like in MMOs, but you don't have to if you don't want to, and it's not necessary to do it. So you can choose between exploring this world on your own and discovering things at your own pace, or doing it with others.
Yeah.
And the world, being an online world, is being constantly updated, and more regions are being generated, and I mean the game's already huge, but it's only going to get bigger.
Yeah. And I think that's the important part of technology catching up to storytelling, and why things don't get old as fast, is like with technology you can patch things. You can have updates, DLC, or yes.
Yeah, DLC.
My brain was just like acronym. The fact that you don't have to like leave the store, or you don't have to leave the house to go to the store to buy a new disc. Like we have the technology where you can just like hook your stuff's like my PS5 is hooked up to the internet. Anytime something comes out new, I can just download it, and it makes the game even bigger. So like the sustainability of games, right? It's not like, you could play Turok 2. I love that game. But you play it and like you're kind of done, right? You do the story, you min-max, you're done. Like Pokemon Blue. You beat the Elite Four, you catch up, you're done. But now, the way technology is advanced, like stories keep getting added onto. And you can keep coming back to them, and they're going to be new as long as somebody's developing stuff for it. Or they're just like intrinsically so many options to run, like the Dark Souls franchise. I love Dark Souls 3. I don't know if I have more hours in Dark Souls 3 than I have in Skyrim. And I've had Dark Souls like less amount of time.
It is a pretty good game.
I mean, the story, you have to piece things together. You have to figure things out yourself. You can build your character like a D&D. That D&D format of character building, strengths, dexterity, like all of that stuff is still in all of these games. So it's funny, like even today, where you're still so close to like the grandfathers, the fathers of these games, right? You see their reflections in all of it. Like even in Final Fantasy with your stats, like the whole stat bar, like it's interesting how these things evolve, like, and technology evolves, but like you can still see like bits and pieces of where they came from imprinted, like the DNA. And I think that's the thing with escapism is like human beings are escapist creatures, and I think we are always looking to kind of leave this world for a bit, or at least imagine it in a way that like makes it easier for us to deal with for whatever problem we're having. I think of like Stardew Valley, right? 8-bit game or 16-bit game, whatever. Pixels. But if you're lonely, or it's like life is, Stardew Valley is a great place to go and just like simulate having like a life in interactions.
Or hugely popular during the pandemic, Animal Crossing.
Yeah.
You just build a little island. People come and say hi, and that's it. There's no risk. Nothing's gonna happen.
There's no PvP.
There's no fighting. There's no conflict. You're just hanging out on an island with some animals.
Like, how many people got through pandemic times because, or I should say lockdown times, like those times where you were really restricted because of escapist worlds?
Say probably everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. It's like, I don't think escapism is about, not avoiding problems, but the way that it's evolved has allowed us to like make connections with people. Like, how many friends do you have because of games?
Pretty much all of them.
Yeah, and I think that's a common thing. Like before, like in the 80s and early 2000s, like the 80s, it was like the D&D nerd who has no friends except for like those 3 people. Or in the early 2000s, like gaming addictions and like how you're not gonna have real friends. It's not real life and blah blah blah.
It's gonna rot your brain.
Yeah, but like real friendships are forged through these things, and I think that speaks to me like the positive aspects of escapism, the positive aspects of these stories and of these worlds that we get into to either cope with crisis. It's not like, somebody has to make the game, but like when it came to for like Tolkien or Howard dealing with the changing world of the 20s, when they wrote their stories, like, that was kind of like again like the roller coaster thing where you could get on and enjoy it. You weren't really interacting with things. Like, I think it was definitely reactive, but like the games and systems we have now, I feel like are proactive for like establishing things. Like a lot of the games that are popular had to be set up already for us to like help cope with like the pandemic, for example. I don't know. I think as the world gets bigger and as we are inundated with like, all this current bad news and like all of like, I feel like escapism and like going into the world of like Elder Scrolls becomes an important mental health point. I can read Lord of the Rings and I love it. I can read Ready Player One and I enjoy it. I enjoy the movies, I enjoy the books, but there's something about the immersion of a video game to me that's escapist. And reading for me is leisurely and enjoyable, but like personally I don't feel it's escapist because I'm not like escaping to the world with them. But like, or like even when I'm watching a movie, like I'm enjoying it, but like there's that moment where you kind of like forget the rest of the world because you're so focused on like the mission, or you're so focused on what you're doing. To me, that's when the escapism happens. When you like are you're in your own character's head so much that you're just like, now I'm escaped.
That you've almost like taken the role of that character.
Yeah. And I think like as technology continues to bump up, that line is gonna get increasingly blurred between like, and I feel like in a way like maybe that the whole thing in the 80s Dungeons and Dragons are like they couldn't tell what was real, and like it has a horror story, right? In Ready Player One, I feel like they deal with that scare a lot better, where it's like the Oasis, which is this place where you put on your VR and you have the school planet, the work planet, The Leisure Planet. I feel like technology in Ready Player One is going to be more apt, but I don't feel like we're going to be so lost that we can't,
Yeah, no, I think we've definitely like touched those places, like with work from home or remote schooling. Like we've definitely touched on that, but we haven't obviously lost ground in reality.
Yeah. And again, in Ready Player One, like, it's the only place, like they say at the end, like, it's the only place that you can get a good meal. And I think with the pandemic and with the technology and like you were saying, we touched on it. I don't think we'll ever lose the need to like have fresh air. Essentially, I don't think we'll ever lose the want to be outside and explore. I think these games and this escapism is lifting us up and out of a very small box, especially as like money buys less. People can't more people rent than own homes. As the bar for the cost of living gets higher, but like things like technology and internet access, like even if you're just mobile gaming, even if you're playing Genshin on your phone or whatever, like that escapism, I think, is a survival tool, and I think it's a mental health tool. I do want to say, by the way, that one thing that we didn't cover as far as escapism goes for the 2000s that was really big was like Harry Potter and the wonderful world of wizarding. Purposely left out because I don't support TERFs, I don't support Rowling, I don't support her work or bigotry or transphobia. So Tolkien, or not Tolkien, I'm sorry, Harry Potter is not going to be left out. We could talk about like the heartbreak of like a place that you went to as a kid to feel safe and feel better, and having that like ripped out from under you as like a queer adult, when you realize the person who made that very overtly doesn't give a shit about you. You could say, oh, Barth, the death of the author, and she put out the work and doesn't, but like, no, I'm not going to give her any more time in this talk. But just so you know, like, aware of Harry Potter, aware of Hogwarts, aware of how much it meant to me and to a lot of people growing up, we'll not talk about it. But getting back to like technology in Cyberpunk in 2077. And like the idea of transhumanism, the idea of like the prison of your flesh, and like how you can like alter different parts of your body.
Cyberpunk 2077 took such a great experience. Cyberpunk Edge Runners. If you have seen it is like, it wonderfully depicts the difference in class.
Yeah.
Through that high-tech little life, because some people will literally just be better because they can afford to be better. Like, there are augmentations that will make you faster, stronger, smarter, see farther, and the only reason that they have them is because they can afford to.
Yeah.
And it gets to the point where being a base-level human, no matter how smart or strong you are, flesh and bone is flesh and bone. It has its limitations. Whereas with these enhancements, people can literally run circles around you.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes me wonder like how much of that is going to be in the future, like 20 years from now, or could we just like, man, I want stronger muscles, so I'm just I'm going to take this synthetic thing that just boosts, like steroids but permanent and better. Or it's like I have this neurochip in my brain that like increases my connection. Or if like, so for me, I have a brain injury. Like, I'm trying to imagine like an implant or a neural net in my brain that like compensates for my inability to do math and just makes me a super genius at it.
It does it for you.
Yeah. I mean, think like right now, like even our phones in our hands. Like, imagine that connection, but no more device. It's now just an implant. So it's not telepathy or anything, but you can access the internet through just like thinking about it. You're like, well, that's crazy, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's so far, like, that one. Yeah, but you know what? Somebody looked at the communicators in Star Trek in the 60s and was like, I'm going to make that. And now we have cell phones that are so ubiquitous, everybody has one.
But I think with that, I mean, I think cyberpunk, the genre, might have called this prediction. Like, because we have that today, right now. Obviously, like we have phones, we have this technology.
Mm-hmm.
There's still people who don't know how to change a tire.
It's true.
Even though it is like a search away.
That's true.